before the first word was spoken and before there was ground to stand on to speak it. There was only chaos, not disorder, as the word would later come to mean, but a yawning gap, a chasm without floor or ceiling, stretching in every direction at once into nothing. It was the beginning of everything, and it was also nothing at all. No light, no dark that could be called dark for lack of light to measure it against. No up, no down, no distance a thing might travel to prove there was distance to travel. And yet within that vast gulf something had already begun to move. Not a being, not yet, but a tension, a pressure, as though somewhere within the emptiness two forces pressed against each other for the very first time. One that would one day be called heat, and one that would one day be called cold, straining against a boundary neither of them yet had a name for. The void convulsed. It buckled and it heaved, the way a held breath finally breaks. And from that first convulsion, everything that would ever exist began, achingly slowly, to be born. Out of that first convulsion came the first solid thing the cosmos had ever held. Where a moment before there had been only gulf and gap, something vast and heavy pressed itself into being, broad, dark, and immovable, spreading outward until it had no edge a mind could find. This was Gaia, the earth herself, broad-breasted and eternal, the first sure footing in a universe that until now had offered nothing to stand on. She did not stir or reach. She simply was, spreading herself wide and deep, patient in a way nothing before her had been. Alongside her, in that same first breath of creation, opened Tartarus, a gulf beneath even her own foundations, and Eros, the force that draws one thing toward another, without whom nothing that followed could ever have been born. Chaos itself, receding into the background from which everything else now sprang, gave rise to Erebus and to Night, twin children of the dark, who would in turn beget Ether, the shining upper air and day. The world had a floor at last. It did not yet have a roof. And Earth, though nothing had yet been born to keep her company, was not content to lie exposed beneath nothing at all. From within herself, without any union or any partner, she brought forth a second vastness equal to her own, Uranus, the starry heaven, spreading himself across her entire breadth until he covered her on every side. He was her match in size and in weight, a dome of night pricked with the first scattered points of light, arching over her the way a roof arches over a hall built to outlast its builders. Where before there had been only the earth stretching flat and unbounded into gulf, now there was a sky pressing close above it, close enough to touch, close enough that the space between them was barely space at all. It was the first shelter the world had ever known, and it was also, though neither of them yet understood this, a cage. Sky pressed down until he touched earth on every side, and where they met, the world convulsed a second time, this time not with the pain of separation, but with the violence of joining. Mountains heaved upward where before there had been only flatness, thrust into being by the sheer pressure of that first embrace. And in the hollows between the rising peaks, water gathered and churned, the first sea-filling basins that had not existed a moment before, restless and unresting, tasting salt for the first time. Everything that would grow, and everything that would one day walk upon the earth or swim within the sea, owed its beginning to that meeting of the two vastest things the cosmos had yet produced. Out of their entwining came children, 12 of them in time, towering and unnamed, shapes still finding their edges in the half-light between their parents' bodies. The age of raw shaping had begun in earnest, and earth and sky, locked together in that first union, would not be parted again for a very long time, not until a blade came looking for the joint between them. From that long entwining came 12 children, towering shapes born one after another into the half-light between their parents, each one vast enough to dwarf anything that would come after. They would in time be given names Oceanus, who would become the great river encircling the whole world; Hyperion, father of the sun and moon and dawn to come; Rhea and Themis and Mnemosyne, whose gifts of motherhood and law and memory were not yet needed by anyone; and others besides, 6 sons and 6 daughters, standing shoulder to shoulder in a world still too new to hold them all. But it was the last of them, the youngest and smallest at his birth, who would matter more than all his older brothers combined. He was given the name Cronus, and even as an infant he watched his father with something in his eyes that was not yet hatred, but would, given time and cause enough, become exactly that. Beneath even Gaia's own vast foundations, in a place so far down that the word below barely reached it, opened Tartarus, a gulf within the gulf, a darkness inside the dark. It had been there since nearly the very beginning, born in that same first breath as Earth herself, and it waited the way only something eternal can wait, without hunger, without impatience, simply present. It was so deep that a bronze anvil, dropped from the surface of the earth, would fall for 9 full days and 9 full nights before it ever struck the floor of that abyss. And a second anvil dropped from the floor of Tartarus toward the earth above would take 9 days more to complete the opposite journey. It was that deep, and it was that far from anything living. No war had yet been fought that would need such a prison. No god had yet done anything terrible enough to deserve such a fall. But Tartarus was already there, patient in the dark beneath everything, and in time it would not stay empty. But not every child born to earth and sky was as easily loved as the Titans had been. Among the last to come were monstrous ones, 3 Cyclopes, each with a single burning eye set in the middle of his forehead, strength and skill enough to forge anything, and 300 Handers, each with 50 heads and 100 arms apiece, force given a body so far beyond ordinary shape that no word yet existed to describe it. Uranus looked on his own children and felt not pride but revulsion. He could not bear the sight of them, could not bear what their existence said about the vastness of what he and Earth together were capable of making. So as each one was born, he seized it and forced it back down into the depths of Gaia's own body, sealing it away in the dark before it had ever seen the sky its father claimed to be. Earth groaned beneath the weight of her own imprisoned children, a pain that had nowhere to go, a grief that curdled, birth after birth, into something far more dangerous than sorrow. She endured it as long as endurance was possible. Then she began, in the silent, patient way that only the oldest things know how to plan. At last, Earth could endure it no longer. Deep within herself, in the dark where her buried children still writhed and wept, she formed a substance harder than any stone yet known, gray flint, sharp along one curved edge, and from it she shaped a great sickle, a blade meant not for harvest but for something far more drastic. When it was finished, she gathered her free children around her, the towering Titans who had never been sealed away, and she told them plainly what she wanted: that one of them take up the blade and turn it against the father who had buried their brothers alive. She pleaded. She showed them the sickle, cold and gleaming even in that dim light, and she asked which of them loved her enough or hated him enough to use it. Her older sons looked away, one after another, silence answering for each of them in turn, whether from fear of their father's size or fear of what such an act would mean for the world itself. None of them would say. Only the youngest stepped forward. Cronus, smallest and by his own admission later the most cunning of them all, took the sickle from his mother's hand without hesitation. He had watched his father's cruelty longer than any of them, being born last, and he had had the longest time to let it curdle into resolve. Night fell, as it always did when Uranus came to lie with Earth, spreading himself down over her entire body, the way he had every night since the world was young. He did not know that this night was different. Hidden in the shadow of his mother's own vast form, sickle gripped tight in his hand, Cronus waited for the moment his father's guard would be lowest. The moment of the embrace itself, when Uranus, blind with the same hunger that had fathered a dozen children before this one, reached down to cover Earth completely. Cronus moved. With his left hand he seized his father, and with his right he swung the flint blade in a single stroke, severing him in the place where a father becomes a father, and cast the torn flesh behind him, out and away, over his shoulder into the waiting dark. Uranus screamed, a sound the young cosmos had never yet heard, a sky torn open by its own child, and reeled back from Earth's body, drawing away from her for the first time since their union began. Where his blood struck the ground, Earth received it and in time brought forth new life from the violence done to her. The fierce Erinyes, spirits of vengeance who would one day hunt down every child who raised a hand against a parent, giants armored for war, and gentle ash-tree nymphs, born strangely tender out of so brutal a wound. Cronus stood over his fallen father, sickle still wet, breathing hard in the sudden distance that had opened between earth and sky for the first time since the world began. He did not know yet what he had started. He knew only that his father would never again press so close, and that the throne his father had claimed by size and by cruelty now stood open for someone bold enough, or ruthless enough, to take it. Where the torn flesh struck the waves, the sea did something it had never done before. It did not simply close back over the wound the way water always closes over whatever falls into it. Instead, it convulsed. White foam boiled up from the point of impact and spread outward in a widening ring that would not settle, would not calm, no matter how much time passed. Beneath that foam, something was gathering, not yet a shape, not yet a name, just a slow accumulation of substance drawn from violence and from salt, and from the strange fertility that seemed to follow Uranus's blood wherever it touched the world. The ring of foam spread and spread, farther than any ordinary wave should have carried it, as though the sea itself understood that what was forming beneath its surface deserved room to take its own shape in its own time. It was not ready yet. It would be in time, in a distant year this story has not reached. For now the water only churned, white and restless, holding its secret just beneath the surface. With his father fallen and the Titans leaderless, Cronus did not hesitate to claim what had just been made available. He took the throne his father had ruled from, not a seat of stone or gold, for none such existed yet, but the simple fact of being obeyed, of standing at the center of the family earth and sky had made together, and having every one of his brothers and sisters look to him first. His first act as ruler was, by all appearances, an act of mercy. He went down into the dark places where his monstrous siblings still lay buried, the one-eyed Cyclopes and the 100-armed giants his father had sealed away out of disgust, and he brought them up into the light. For a time, it seemed the age of cruelty had ended with Uranus's fall. Cronus ruled, and under his rule the world knew a peace and an abundance later ages would remember as golden. Grain grew without the need for plowing. Want was a stranger, and no one yet had reason to fear the one who sat at the center of it all. But an age of gold is, by its nature, a fragile thing, resting on a single choice made in a single moment. And Cronus had already shown, with a sickle in the dark, exactly what he was capable of when he felt threatened. His mercy toward his buried siblings would not, in the end, prove permanent, nor would his own throne prove as secure as the golden fields around it made it feel. Cronus had married his sister Rhea, one of the Titans born in that same first generation, and in time she began to bear him children. But a prophecy had reached him, a warning that a son of his own would someday do to him exactly what he had just done to Uranus. Cronus had unseated a father. He had no intention of being unseated by one of his own. So when Rhea's first child was born, a daughter named Hestia, Cronus took her from her mother's arms, and before Rhea could so much as name her properly to the world, swallowed her whole. He did the same with the second child, Demeter, and the third, Hera, and then with his brothers Hades and Poseidon as each in turn was placed, wailing into his waiting hands. He did not hesitate, and he did not explain himself beyond the one truth he held above all others, that no child of his would live to grow strong enough to lift a blade against him the way he had lifted one against his own father. Rhea watched each of her children vanish into her husband in turn, and grief settled into her like a stone she could not put down, deeper with every birth, until by the fifth child she could no longer bear the thought of watching a sixth disappear the same way. When Rhea felt the sixth child stir within her, she could not face losing this one the way she had lost the other five. She went to earth and starry heaven, her own parents, the very pair whose falling out had started this entire chain of swallowed children, and begged them for a way to save the child she had not yet even held. They gave her a plan. She would go to Crete to give birth, far from Cronus's sight, and Earth herself would take the newborn in and hide him away on the island's tallest mountain. And for Cronus, so that he would notice nothing wrong, Rhea wrapped a great stone in swaddling bands, bound it the way she would have bound an infant, and carried it to her husband as though it were the very child she had just born. Cronus, who had shown no gentleness and asked no questions with any of the other five, showed none now either. He took the bundle from her hands without a glance at her face, and swallowed it whole in one convulsive gulp, exactly as he had swallowed each child before it. He noticed nothing. He felt no difference in weight, no wrongness in the shape sliding down his throat. He believed completely that he had just erased the danger of a sixth heir the same way he had erased the first five. He had never once been more wrong about anything in his long, suspicious life. Far from her husband's hungry reach, on the island of Crete, Rhea gave birth in secret to a son. She named him Zeus, and she did not have long to hold him before the plan Earth and Heaven had given her required that she let him go. Earth herself received the infant and carried him up into the folds of Mount Ida, to a cave hidden so deep in rock and forest that no searching eye, mortal or divine, could have found it by accident. There the child was left in the care of nymphs of the mountain, who fed him and kept him warm and understood, better than most, how much depended on his survival. But an infant, however destined for greatness, cries the way any infant cries, and the sound of a newborn god's wailing was not a thing that could be risked drifting down from the mountainside to reach Cronus's ears in his hall below. So the Curetes came, young armored dancers devoted to guarding the child, and whenever Zeus cried they beat their spears against their shields in a deafening, rhythmic clamor, clashing bronze on bronze in a dance loud enough to swallow any infant's voice entirely. Below in the Titan's hall, Cronus heard nothing but the ordinary silence of a threat he believed he had already erased. He ruled on, satisfied, unaware that the very thing his swallowed stone had been meant to prevent was, at that moment, growing stronger with every clashing beat of bronze on Mount Ida, a world of ignorance away from him. The months became years, and on the slopes of Mount Ida, hidden from a father who did not yet know to look for him, the infant grew. He was fed on the milk of a sacred goat, and on wild honey gathered from the mountain's own hives, sweetness enough to make up for a childhood spent in hiding rather than in any hall built for a god. He grew quickly, the way children of that first divine generation seemed to, his limbs lengthening, his shoulders broadening, strength gathering in him the way storm clouds gather before anyone below has noticed the sky changing color. He did not yet know his own name carried any weight. He did not know that a stone was, at that very moment, sitting undigested and unnoticed inside his own father, waiting in Cronus's belly the way he himself had once waited in his mother's. He knew only the mountain, the nymphs who raised him, and the rhythm of shields clashing whenever his voice rose too loud. Somewhere below him, an entire golden world went on turning, entirely unaware of what was quietly finishing its growing on the slopes above it. Below the mountain where the godchild grew, the world Cronus ruled stretched on in every direction, vast and golden and entirely at peace. Seas he had never crossed rolled against shores he had never walked. Titans he called brother and sister governed their own corners of that world, without a single thought spared for the infant hidden above them on Crete. It was, by every visible measure, exactly the world Cronus had meant to build when he swallowed his fifth child, and believed he had swallowed his sixth. A world with no threat left in it, a throne with nothing left to fear. And yet the fear that had driven him to swallow his own children in the first place had never actually gone away. It had only gone quiet, the way a coal goes quiet under ash without ever quite going out. Somewhere in that vast, unsuspecting kingdom, a stone sat heavy and undigested in his belly, a reminder he did not recognize for what it was. And somewhere in the mountains above him, an infant who would one day answer that fear in full was already growing stronger with every passing season. Patient in the way only the very young and the very old can afford to be, waiting for a world that did not yet know to be afraid of him. The child Cronus feared had not perished on Crete, and he had not stayed small. Years folded over the cave on Mount Ida, and the infant the Curetes had drowned in clashing bronze grew into a young god with a will as hard as his father's own flint sickle. When Zeus came down from the mountain at last, he did not come with an army. He came as a servant. He walked into his father's hall grown to manhood, his eyes storm gray beneath a plain cloak, and took up the cup meant for the king's table, a stranger among Titans who had no idea they were already looking at their own downfall. Guided by Medes, cleverest of the Titan daughters, he carried with him a bitter draught ground from herb and gall, and he slipped it into Cronus's wine with a servant's practiced calm. Cronus drank without a second thought. He had swallowed far worse without flinching, and did not feel the poison working until it was already too late to refuse it. Then the convulsions began. The Titan king who had devoured his own children whole, the instant each was placed in his arms, doubled over on his own throne and began to disgorge everything he had ever swallowed, in the reverse of the order he had taken it in. First came up the stone, the one Rhea had wrapped in swaddling bands and fed him in place of his sixth child, still cold and unmarked after years undigested. Then came Poseidon, then Hades, then Hera, then Demeter, and last of all, having sat longest and deepest in their father's belly, Hestia, the firstborn, disgorged whole and furious, blinking against a light none of them had seen since the hour of their birth. For the first time since the moment of their births, 5 gods stood beneath open sky. Hestia, eldest and gravest, looked at her own hands as if she had never truly owned them. Demeter turned her face up toward the sun as though relearning its warmth. Hera walked in a slow circle, measuring the space around her with new, wondering eyes. Hades said nothing at all, his gaze already drawn toward the dark places between things, the shadow under every rock. And Poseidon crouched at the water's edge, trailing his fingers through the current as if greeting an old, half-remembered friend. Zeus stood apart from them, watching the family his father had tried to erase stand upright at last, 5 siblings breathing free air, blinking, and utterly unaware, yet that the war which would decide the shape of the world had already begun the moment their father's stomach emptied. Zeus did not march straight to war. He went down first, deeper than any god had gone, into the iron dark of Tartarus, where the one-eyed Cyclopes, Brontes, Steropes, and Arges had lain chained since Uranus first recoiled from the sight of them, and where the 100-handed giants, Cottus, Briareus, and Gyges, had waited even longer for a jailer who never came. Zeus broke their chains himself and offered a bargain plain enough for prisoners to trust. Fight beside him, and Tartarus would never hold them again. That night, in a forge lit only by their own fire, the Cyclopes worked without rest. From raw thunder and raw lightning, they hammered a bolt that did not merely burn but judged, a weapon with a will bent to its wielder's hand. For Poseidon, they shaped a trident that could crack the seabed like a rib cage. For Hades, they forged a helm of night itself, sewn from shadow, that could hide a god from every eye in creation. By the time the sky began to gray with morning, 3 gifts lay cooling on the anvil, and the war the Titans had assumed they would win by numbers alone had just quietly stopped being fair. With their new weapons, the Olympians took their stand on the peak of Olympus, and across the gulf of sky, the Titans massed on the black slopes of Othrys, and for 10 years neither side broke. It was not a war measured in single battles, but in an unbroken decade of collision. Mountains hurled like stones, rivers boiling in their beds, the sea itself flung skyward and falling back as rain. Neither Titan strength nor Olympian cunning alone could end it. Every gain one day was lost the next, and the earth between the 2 peaks grew scorched and unrecognizable, a wound that would not close. It was, by every account that survived it, the longest and most exhausting war the cosmos had yet seen. And both sides fully expected it to simply grind on forever, until the freed prisoners of Tartarus finally tipped the scale. It was the 100-handers who broke the stalemate. Cottus, Briareus, and Gyges, each with 100 arms swinging in a single motion, gathered boulders by the armful and let fly, not 1 stone, not a volley, but 300 at once, hurled with a force that blotted out the stars and turned daylight to dust-choked twilight. The Titans, who had never faced a weapon like this because nothing like it had ever existed, staggered under a bombardment that fell faster than they could raise a shield or a curse. The ground split. The sky itself seemed to buckle inward, as though the seams of the world were coming apart at exactly the place 2 armies had chosen to stand and refuse to yield. It was the beginning of the end, though neither side quite knew yet that it was the end. When the moment came, Zeus did not wait for the 100-handers to finish the work. He stepped to the front of the Olympian line himself, and for the first time since the forge had cooled, he raised the bolt the Cyclopes had built for exactly this instant. What left his hand was not simply fire. It was judgment made visible, a jagged white wound torn straight through the sky, and it struck Mount Othrys itself. The mountain did not merely burn, it caught, root to peak, in a single continuous sheet of flame, the black rock glowing molten in the dark. The Titan war line lit from beneath as if the earth had opened its own furnace beneath their feet. Steam boiled where the fire touched melting snow. The sea for miles around the mountain's roots began to seethe. Titans who had stood unmoved through 10 years of siege broke and scattered before a weapon that did not merely wound. It announced who was going to win, and did not much care how long the losing side wanted to argue about it. Zeus loosed bolt after bolt, and each one landed like the closing of an argument nobody else had been invited to have. By the time the smoke cleared over the ruin of Othries, the Titan line was not merely broken. It no longer existed as a line at all, and the 10-year war that both sides had assumed might never end had ended in the space of a single, blinding afternoon. What remained of the Titan host was rounded up and marched, bound and silent, down through the same iron dark their own children had once been dragged up from. Cronus walked at the front of that grim column, the bronze crown he had worn since he first seized his father's throne now just one more weight among the chains. Behind the defeated Titan stood gates of solid bronze, set into a bronze wall so thick and so deep that a falling anvil, thrown from the threshold above, would fall for 9 full days before it ever struck the floor below. Through those gates the Titans went, and the gates closed, and Cottus, Briareus, and Gyges, the very giants Cronus's own father had once tried to bury forever, took up positions as their eternal jailers, a debt of imprisonment repaid in the coin of imprisonment. Only one Titan was spared that particular sentence and given a harsher one instead. Atlas, who had led the Titan armies in the field, was marched not down into the dark but out to the world's furthest western rim, and there he was made to kneel, and the whole weight of the sky was lowered onto his shoulders, to be held there without relief, without end, for as long as the sky itself needed holding up. With the Titans buried and Atlas condemned to his post at the world's edge, the 3 brothers who had done the most to win the war turned to the question of what, exactly, they had won. There was no eldest son's claim to fall back on. Zeus had been swallowed last and freed first, and rank by birth order had stopped meaning anything the moment their father's stomach emptied. So the brothers did what gods do when pride and fairness both need satisfying at once. They drew lots. Into a helmet went 3 marks, and out came a division of everything that existed above the earth's own surface, which the 3 of them agreed to hold in common, along with the towering peak of Olympus itself. Zeus drew the sky, and with it the thunder that had already made his name. Poseidon drew the sea, every current and every drowned thing within it, and the trident that had been forged for exactly this authority. And Hades drew the lot no one else wanted and no one else argued over. The realm beneath the realm, the kingdom of the dead, a throne in the dark that came with no crowds cheering its winner and no rival trying to take it from him. He accepted it without complaint, went down, and did not come back up to object. Not every Titan fell with Othries. One had seen the war coming years before it began, and had chosen, quietly and without announcement, not to fight on the losing side. His name was Prometheus, forethought, in the old tongue, and his gift was not strength or cunning in battle, but a clarity about consequences that none of his kin had ever managed to develop. Spared for that foresight, he found himself standing in a world the Olympians now owned outright, empty of anything that could walk upright and wonder at it. So he knelt at the riverbank, and he took up wet clay in his hands, and he began, patiently, the way a craftsman begins something he already knows will take a very long time to get right. He mixed the river's clay with his own tears, some say with the tears of Earth herself, still grieving everything her children had done to one another, and he shaped a figure with 2 legs and 2 arms, and a face turned up toward the sky rather than down toward the mud it had come from. unlike every beast that already walked the world on 4 legs and never looked higher than its next meal. When the shape was finished, he breathed into it, and it stirred and it stood. He made another, and another, working alone on that riverbank for what the old stories say was an age unmeasured by any calendar, until there were enough of these new, fragile, upright creatures to call a people. He called them nothing in particular. He simply made them, and loved what he had made in the particular way that only a maker can, and did not yet know how much that love was going to cost him. Prometheus had made men, but he had not made them capable of surviving what he had made them into. They shivered through the cold months with nothing to warm them, ate their meat raw, and watched the animals around them, who had claws and fur and fangs, thrive at their expense. Prometheus went to Zeus and asked, on behalf of the strange new creatures he had shaped, for fire, the one thing that would let them cook their food, warm their shelters, and eventually forge tools of their own. Zeus refused outright. Fire belonged to Olympus. It was not a gift to be handed down to creatures who had not yet earned so much as a name for themselves, let alone the power that had ended a 10-year war. Prometheus did not argue the point twice. He went instead to the forge on Olympus by night, and from a single glowing coal, he lit the dry, pale pith inside a hollow fennel stalk. A stalk chosen precisely because its fibrous core would smolder for hours without bursting into open flame and giving him away. He carried it down the mountain hidden in his own hand, past watchful gods who never thought to look for a god smuggling contraband inside a plant, and he placed the coal among the first gathered kindling mankind had ever been given. It caught. Somewhere below Olympus, for the first time, a fire burned that Zeus had not lit and had not permitted, and every hearth that would ever burn afterward owed its first spark to that single stolen coal. Zeus felt the theft before anyone told him of it. A fire burning somewhere below that he had not kindled has a way of announcing itself to the god who rules the sky. His fury did not fall on mankind, not yet. It fell entirely on the one who had armed them. Prometheus was seized, dragged to the farthest edge of the known world, to a crag in the Caucasus Mountains where the wind never stopped and the rock never warmed. And there he was bound, not with rope, not with any chain a smith could forge, but with unbreakable bonds driven directly through his own flesh into the stone. So that escape was never a question of strength, but simply, permanently, impossible. He was left in full view of the sky he had defied, exposed to every storm Zeus chose to send. And each morning an eagle came, unhurried, and tore open his side and fed on his liver. And each night the wound closed, because Prometheus was a Titan and could not simply be allowed to die and be finished with it. He would wake to it again the next dawn, and the eagle would come again. And this was not a punishment with an ending built into it. It was meant to go on visibly, for as long as Zeus wanted the rest of creation to remember exactly what happened to a god who decided mankind's comfort mattered more than Olympus's monopoly on fire. Mankind now had fire, and Zeus was not finished settling the account. If he could not undo what Prometheus had given, he could balance it with a gift of his own, one that would look, on the surface, like the finest thing anyone had ever received. He ordered Hephaestus to shape a woman from earth and water, and every god added something before she opened her eyes. Athena dressed her in silver-white robes and taught her the loom. Aphrodite gave her a beauty that could stop an argument mid-sentence. Hermes gave her a clever tongue and a curiosity that would never once know when to stop asking questions. They named her Pandora, all gifted, and gave her one thing more, a sealed jar and a single instruction never to open it. No one told her what was inside, only that it must stay closed. Curiosity finished the work Zeus had built into her from the start. She lifted the lid only far enough to look, and every evil that had never yet touched the world, sickness, grief, envy, old age, war, and 100 griefs with no names yet, poured out in a single breath and scattered into every corner of the earth before she could force the lid shut again. Only one thing had not yet escaped when she finally sealed the jar. It stayed at the bottom, pale and quiet. Hope, the one gift slow enough to be caught in time. 2 acts of defiance and desire had reshaped what it meant to be alive in the world below Olympus. Fire now burned in mortal hearths that Zeus had never sanctioned, and every evil that had ever been given a name now moved freely through the same air mortals breathed, let loose by a curiosity built into the very first woman on purpose. The easy age, if it had ever truly been easy, was over. Somewhere on a windswept crag in the Caucasus, an eagle finished its meal and rose into the gray sky, and would return again at dawn, because Prometheus was chained where the whole world could see exactly what defiance of Olympus cost, and his voice carried farther than Zeus had perhaps intended. A long, unbroken scream of protest that would echo through the mountains for longer than anyone alive at that moment could imagine. Above, on Olympus, 12 empty thrones waited to be filled by gods whose stories were only beginning, in a world that was now, for better and for worse, exactly as hard and as bright and as full of both fire and suffering as its makers had made it. High above the reach of weather, where the last clouds thin and the air itself seems to hold its breath, the mountain called Olympus stands crowned in permanent mist. Here, on a summit no mortal foot will ever measure, 12 thrones wait in a wide circle, cut from stone that never weathers and gold that never tarnishes. Not long ago there was only a war's ragged aftermath, a defeated race chained beneath the earth, a titan still screaming on a Caucasian crag, a jar someone should never have opened. Now there is order, or the beginning of one. Some of these seats are already spoken for. Others are still cold, waiting for gods not yet born, not yet risen from the sea, not yet even conceived of. The age of open war is over. The age of rivalry, of favor and grudge, of gifts given and terribly repaid, is only just beginning. And every throne here will eventually be filled by someone with a temper to match a god's power. Zeus has ruled the sky for some time now, long enough to have taken lovers and made enemies of half of them. When Gaia comes to him with the same warning she once gave his father, and his father before that, his first wife, the Titaness Medes, wisest of all beings, the very one whose potion once made Cronus disgorge his swallowed children, is carrying a child. A daughter first, Gaia says, and after her a son who will grow to overthrow his father exactly as Zeus overthrew his own. The pattern is old enough that Zeus recognizes it instantly, because he has lived inside it his whole life. Uranus buried his children, Cronus swallowed his, and now the same trap is closing around him in a new shape. He does not choose burial. He does not choose the crude gulp his father used, blind and unknowing. Zeus is cunning in a way Cronus never was, and so he flatters Medes, coaxes her small with sweet words and a shrinking game, and swallows her whole and awake. He expects silence. What he gets instead is stranger. Her wisdom does not die inside him. It settles into him, becomes a part of how he thinks, an unbroken counsel murmuring at the root of every judgment he will ever make again. He has stopped a prophecy the only way he knows how, not by refusing the danger, but by consuming it and calling the result his own strength. It will not be the last time this particular solution proves incomplete. Something is still growing inside him that was never meant to stay contained. And before long, it will announce itself in a way no one on the mountain will be able to ignore. The pain starts as a pressure behind Zeus's eyes and becomes, within days, an agony no god has ever had to endure, a splitting weight behind his skull that no draught or rest can ease. He roars through the halls of Olympus until even the other gods flinch from the sound. It is Prometheus, still owed a debt for the fire he once stole and the punishment that followed it, who steps forward with an axe and does what none of the others dare. He strikes Zeus's skull cleanly open. What comes out is not blood. Athena leaps from the wound already an adult, already armored, helm-crested, spear in hand, the fringed aegis with its carved Gorgon face slung across her shoulder, and lets out a war cry so total that Olympus itself seems to shudder on its foundations, the sea below flinching into sudden swells. She is Medes' daughter and Zeus's alike, wisdom made martial, born owing nothing to infancy or weakness. The gods who gather around her do not see a child to be raised. They see a second mind for the king of the sky, already grown, already armed, and already more than a match for anyone who underestimates her. A new city is rising on the Attic coast, its harbor good, its rock high and defensible, and two gods want their name attached to it. Poseidon arrives first, strikes the high rock with his trident, and a spring bursts open at the blow. Seawater, salt and useless for drinking, but a spring all the same, and a display of raw power no one watching can dismiss. Athena answers without violence. She kneels at the same rock and plants a single olive tree, gray-leaved and modest beside the sea god's dramatic gift, offering food, oil, and wood all from one patient, growing thing. The king of the new city, weighing a display of force against a promise of long provision, calls the people to decide, and they choose the tree. Poseidon does not take the loss well, no sea god ever does, but the city keeps her name from that day forward, and the olive keeps growing on the rock where the contest was decided, a small green reminder that the gods do not always reward the loudest gift. Poseidon does not forgive easily, and losing a city to a tree stings worse than any wound a weapon could leave. He returns to the plain below the new city, wet dark beard streaming, sea-green light crackling around the trident's points, and drives it into the earth once more, not for a spring this time, but for a reckoning. The plain drowns under a bitter saltwater flood that spreads field by field, swallowing the low farmland the city depends on, turning good soil the color of the sea. It is not a war he can win outright. Athena's gift stands untouched on the high rock, the olive tree still growing, but it is a wound he can leave behind as a message. That patronage was never entirely free, that the sea remembers exactly how it lost, and that gods do not need to overturn a verdict to make the losing side pay for it. The waters will recede in time. The grudge, like most grudges among the 12, will not. Leto is pregnant by Zeus, and Hera will not let her forget it. Wherever she turns for a place to give birth, the ground itself seems to refuse her. No island, no mainland shore will risk the fixed earth beneath it against a jealous queen's fury. She wanders like this for what feels like an age, turned away again and again, until she reaches Delos, a bare floating rock that belongs to no one and is anchored to nothing, and so has nothing Hera's curse can threaten. The island agrees to receive her, on the promise that the child born here will build it a temple and never forget the debt. Labor lasts 9 days and 9 nights before Artemis is born first, small and already sure-handed, and turns at once to help deliver her own twin brother, Apollo arriving into daylight, And the moment he does, the whole floating rock is said to have rooted itself to the seafloor for good, no longer drifting, fixed forever as the birthplace of two gods who will spend their lives, in different ways, hunting down whatever threatens what they love. At the exact center of the earth measured, so the story goes, by two eagles Zeus once released from opposite ends of the world, flying toward each other until they met over a single mountainside in Phasis. A narrow chasm splits the rock. A thin, sweet vapor rises from it without pause, day and night, summer and winter, curling up out of the dark like a breath the earth itself cannot stop taking. No temple stands here yet. No priestess sits at the chasm's edge to breathe the vapor and speak in riddles for kings and generals, who will one day travel across the known world to ask her what the future holds. For now, the chasm belongs to something older and less accommodating than any god of Olympus. A serpent, born of Gaia, coiled in the rocks around the oracle seat, guarding a secret that has not yet chosen its keeper. Typhon is old, older than most of what walks or crawls in the young world. A serpent guardian set here by Gaia herself, and used, in more recent memory, as one more weapon in Hera's long campaign against Leto, chasing the pregnant Titaness's daughter across half the earth before she ever reached Delos. Apollo has not forgotten this, even though he is only days old himself. He tracks the serpent back to its own chasm, the very rock where the earth breathes its sweet vapor, moving with a purpose that startles the older gods watching. This is not a child's tantrum but a hunt, precise and already lethal. His first arrows, loosed one after another from the golden bow at his back, find their mark before Typhon can fully turn on him. The serpent dies coiled around the oracle seat it once guarded for someone else's purposes, and Apollo claims the chasm, the vapor, and the prophecy that will rise from it as his own from that day forward. The god of light taking for himself the one place on earth where the future can be heard before it arrives. Hermes is born at dawn in a cave on Mount Cyllene, and by nightfall of that same day, he has already committed his first theft. He slips from his cradle, walks to the pastures where Apollo's sacred cattle graze, and drives 50 of them off backward, reversing their tracks, wrapping his own small feet in bark and branches, so that anyone reading the ground would swear the herd walked toward the pasture rather than away from it. Along the way he stumbles across a tortoise, kills it without particular malice, and strings its hollowed shell with cattle gut, inventing an instrument that has never existed before this moment. Apollo tracks the theft anyway, cattle trails or no, and confronts his infant half-brother furious enough to drag him before Zeus himself. But Hermes, still hours old, has already learned the family trick better than most gods learn it in a lifetime. He plays the new lyre, and its sound is so unlike anything Apollo has ever heard that his fury dissolves into wonder. The cattle are returned. The lyre changes hands instead, a peace offering that becomes Apollo's signature instrument, and the two brothers part on terms neither expected when the day began. Semele is mortal, and mortal enough to be talked into a mistake that no lover of Zeus's has ever survived making. Hera, disguised as an old nurse, plants the doubt carefully. If this really is the king of the gods visiting her bed, let him prove it. Let him come to her exactly as he comes to Hera, in his true and total glory. Zeus has sworn an oath on the river Styx to grant Semele any wish, and an oath sworn on that river cannot be unmade even by the god who swore it. He arrives as promised, thunderbolt and all, and the same fire that lights the sky burns Semele to ash where she stands. What survives is the child in her womb, not yet ready for the world. Zeus tears the unborn infant free and sews it into his own thigh, carrying the pregnancy the rest of the way himself, until the months are done, and he opens the wound to release a son fully formed, Dionysus, born once from a mortal mother and once from a god's own body, the only one of the 12 circle who can say he was born twice. Dionysus, grown now and traveling the wine-dark coastline in the shape of a young man too fine-dressed for a common traveler, is spotted by a crew of pirates who see easy ransom rather than a god in disguise. They seize him, bind him in ropes that will not hold a river nymph, let alone a god, and steer for a slave market. The helmsman alone senses something wrong and begs the crew to let their strange passenger go. They ignore him. Dionysus lets the ropes fall away on their own and turns the whole ship into an argument the pirates cannot win. Wild grapevines burst up through the deck planking and climb the mast. Wine floods the bilge in place of seawater, and a phantom bear roars somewhere near the prow. The crew, screaming, leaps overboard rather than face whatever the ship has become. And the moment they hit the water, Dionysus turns every one of them into a dolphin, sparing only the helmsman who tried to stop it. It is the first hard lesson in a rule the god of wine will enforce for the rest of his career. Hospitality refused to a stranger is not a small offense on his watch. Somewhere between Cyprus and the mainland, the water changes in a way sailors have never fully agreed how to describe. It is not blue in any simple sense, not gray, not quite purple, but something that shifts with the light and the depth and the sailor's own mood, until the old poets give up trying to pin the color down and just call it wine dark, and let every listener imagine their own version of it. It is deep water, old water, the same sea that once carried a Titan's severed blood into foam, and will soon carry a great deal more. Gods born from it, gods punished across it, heroes wrecked and saved on its currents for generations to come. For now it simply rolls, unclaimed and enormous, waiting for the next thing it is going to produce. The foam has been drifting since the very first violence of the world, since Cronus's sickle struck his father down and the severed flesh hit the sea, boiling the water white in a ring that never quite settled, all the way back before Zeus, before Cronus's own throne, before anything in this story had a name yet. It has taken this long and this much distance to finally decide what it is becoming. Off the coast of Cyprus, the foam gathers, thickens, folds inward on itself, and rises from the water as a fully grown woman already luminous with a beauty that seems to bend the light around her. She steps onto the shore trailing sea foam like a train, myrtle already growing at the waterline to meet her, doves circling overhead before she has taken her first breath of open air. She owes nothing to any mother, any labor, any childhood. She arrives complete, born of the sea's oldest wound turned, against every expectation, into something that will be called beautiful for as long as anyone tells this story. Hera gives birth to Hephaestus alone, without Zeus, some say out of spite for Athena's motherless birth from her husband's skull, and when she looks at the child she has made, she does not see a future god worth keeping. He is born lame, one leg twisted from the other, and Hera's disgust is instant and absolute. She seizes him by the ankle and hurls him from the mountain's edge before he is even old enough to understand what is happening to him. He falls for a full day and a night, tumbling through open sky with no one on Olympus troubling themselves to catch him, until the sea below finally does what his own mother would not. Thetis and Uranus, sea goddesses who happen to be near enough to see him falling, gather him up before the water can finish what Hera started. He spends 9 years hidden in an underwater grotto forge fire burning where no god thinks to look for it. And in that exile, unwanted and unclaimed, Hephaestus becomes the finest craftsman the 12 will ever have. Every hammer blow in that hidden grotto a small, patient answer to the mountain that threw him away. Hephaestus returns to Olympus grown, his craft undeniable even to the mother who threw him away, and is given Aphrodite for a wife, a match that satisfies no one less than Aphrodite herself, married to a soot-stained smith with a permanent limp, while the sky is full of gods who would gladly have taken his place. Ares, heavy in his armor and never shy about wanting what belongs to someone else, becomes her lover instead, and the two of them grow careless enough to believe the affair is a secret. It is not. Helios, who sees everything from his daily path across the sky, reports it back to the forge, and Hephaestus, rather than confronting either of them with a weapon, does what he does best. He builds a net finer than any thread the eye can follow, invisible and unbreakable, and rigs it above his own marriage bed. The next time Ares and Aphrodite meet there, the net drops and holds them fast, tangled together and unable to move, while Hephaestus throws open the doors and calls every god on Olympus to come and see exactly what his wife thinks of him. Even the king of the gods is not safe from his own household forever. Hera, still nursing old grievances too numerous to name, conspires with Poseidon and Athena, an alliance strange enough on its own, sea god and war goddess and queen united against the one throne above all three of theirs, to bind Zeus in golden chains while he sleeps, too heavy and too well fastened for even his strength to break on waking. For a while it works. Zeus wakes bound and furious, unable to reach the thunderbolt that would normally end any argument in his favor, and the conspirators stand over him deciding what comes next. It is Thetis, the sea nymph Zeus once desired and then quietly gave up after a warning he still has not fully explained to anyone, who saves him. She alone remembers Briareus, one of the giant hundred-handers freed from Tartarus after the war with the Titans, and summons him to Olympus. Briareus's 100 hands make short work of chains built for a single god's strength, and Zeus rises free again. The debt to Thetis quietly noted, the conspirators quietly forgiven, and the household's peace held together, for now, by nothing sturdier than fear and old favors owed. Io is a priestess, mortal and unremarkable until Zeus notices her, and by then unremarkable is no longer an option available to her. He comes to her wrapped in a dense cloud meant to hide the affair from Hera's sight, but Hera has learned by now to be suspicious of any cloud that appears from nowhere on a clear day, and she descends to investigate. Zeus, caught, does the only thing he can think to do quickly enough. He turns Io into a white heifer before Hera arrives, a disguise so sudden even he seems unsure it will hold. Hera is not fooled for a moment, but she plays along with cold precision, admiring the heifer aloud and asking for it as a gift. Zeus cannot refuse without confirming everything she already suspects, so he hands his own lover over. Hera sets Argus Panops, a giant with 100 eyes scattered across his body, to guard the heifer day and night. Some of his eyes always open even while the rest sleep, and Io is left to graze in her stolen shape, watched without pause, waiting for a rescue that has not arrived yet. Europa is a Phoenician princess playing with her attendants near the shore when a white bull wanders out of the herd grazing nearby and lies down at her feet, gentle enough that she loses her fear of it within a few minutes and climbs onto its back to see how it feels. The bull waits until she is settled, comfortable, laughing with her friends at how tame the huge animal has turned out to be, and then rises and walks, unhurried into the sea. By the time Europa understands this is not a game, the shore is already far behind and the bull is swimming, steady and untiring, across open water that no ordinary animal could cross. It is Zeus, of course, wearing the shape long enough to carry her all the way to Crete, where he finally reveals himself and where she will settle, mother of kings, on a coast that will one day bear other names but never quite lose the memory of how she arrived there, carried by a god pretending, for one afternoon, to be gentle. The Titan has been chained to this crag long enough that the eagle sent to feed on his regrowing liver each day has become almost routine, a wound that never quite finishes healing before it starts again. Prometheus knew this punishment was coming when he stole the fire, and he has known something else this whole time too, something he has never once offered Zeus freely. A prophecy about a son who could end him, the same shape of doom that has already claimed Uranus and Cronus in turn. He has watched Zeus's interest turn, more recently, toward Thetis, the sea nymph whose beauty half of Olympus has noticed. Prometheus finally speaks, not out of mercy but calculation, a warning traded perhaps for the chance of eventual release. Thetis's son, whoever fathers him, will grow to surpass his father entirely. Zeus does not need to hear the rest. He withdraws from her immediately, forgoes the son he might have had, and quietly arranges for Thetis to marry a mortal man instead, safely outside the succession the prophecy threatens. It is a small, careful act of self-preservation, made at another's expense as usual. And on the rock, still chained, still bleeding, Prometheus watches the warning land exactly as he intended, knowing full well it changes nothing about his own sentence. Niobe, queen of Thebes, has 14 children, 7 sons and 7 daughters, more than any mortal mother in living memory. And she is proud of them in a way that tips, without her quite noticing, into something closer to a challenge thrown at heaven itself. At a festival meant to honor Leto, mother of only 2 children, Niobe stands up and says plainly that her own house has earned the greater worship. 14 against 2 is no contest at all. It is exactly the wrong claim to make in a city where Leto's twins can hear it. Apollo and Artemis do not deliberate long. Within a single day, moving as one, they answer the boast directly, Apollo's arrows finding Niobe's sons one after another, Artemis's finding her daughters, until every child of the 14 lies dead by nightfall, and the queen who compared herself favorably to a goddess is left with nothing left to boast about. Niobe weeps until the story says she turns to stone entirely, a weeping rock on a mountainside that some travelers still claim runs with water even in dry season. Grief made permanent as the price of one careless comparison. Artemis guards her privacy the way she guards everything else she claims as hers completely, and without patience for accidents. She has gone with her nymphs to bathe in a hidden spring deep in the hills, a place she has used for this purpose more times than she could count without ever once being disturbed. Until the day, a young hunter named Actaeon, tracking game through unfamiliar country, wanders off his path and straight into the clearing. He does not mean to see what he sees. It does not matter. The goddess's fury is immediate and absolute, and rather than strike him down outright, she does something crueler. She flicks water toward him and speaks a curse that reshapes his body on the spot, antlers sprouting from his skull, his limbs lengthening and folding into a stag's, his voice failing into a wordless bellow before he can even try to explain himself. He flees into the trees already half transformed, and what happens to him next belongs to his own hounds, waiting nearby, who have never once needed to see their master's face to know when it is time to hunt. Long before Marsyas ever touches it, the instrument that will destroy him has already been thrown away once. Athena invented the double flute, the aulos, and played it proudly at a gathering of gods until she caught her own reflection in a river and saw what the playing did to her face, cheeks swollen, jaw straining, nothing like the composed warrior she preferred to be. She cursed the instrument on the spot and cast it into the water, and there it drifted until Marsyas, a satyr with more talent than judgment, found it lying in the reeds and taught himself to play it better than anyone alive. He grows so confident in his skill that he makes the mistake every mortal eventually makes on this mountain's account. He challenges a god outright, daring Apollo to a contest, flute against lyre, judged by the muses. Apollo wins by a trick as much as by skill, turning his lyre upside down and singing while he plays, a feat the flute cannot match note for note. The contest's terms had been set in advance. The winner does whatever he likes with the loser, and Apollo, who rarely forgives being made to compete at all, claims the full price of a satyr's overreach. Tiresias is young and out walking on a wooded slope of Cyllene when he comes across two serpents coiled together in the grass, mating, and strikes at them with his staff without thinking much about it. The gods do not let a moment like that pass unanswered. He is transformed instantly into a woman and lives that way for 7 years before he crosses the same pair of snakes again, strikes them a second time, and is changed back. Years later on Olympus, Zeus and Hera fall into an argument neither will let go of, which sex takes the greater pleasure in love. Having lived as both, Tiresias is the only judge either god will accept, and he answers honestly, siding with Zeus over Hera. Hera's fury is instant and permanent. She strikes him blind where he stands, a punishment even Zeus cannot undo once another god has already dealt it. What Zeus can do instead is compensate. He gives Tiresias the gift of true prophecy, and a lifespan stretched across 7 generations of mortal men, sight for sight. A blind man who will see the future more clearly than anyone with working eyes. Actaeon is a grandson of Cadmus and one of the finest young hunters in Boeotia. Out in the hills with 50 hounds he has raised and named himself. When the trail he is following leads him, by nothing more than bad luck, into a hidden grotto where Artemis and her nymphs are bathing after their own hunt. He freezes at the clearing's edge, too startled to look away fast enough, and the goddess sees him seeing her. There is no arguing with what happens next. His body begins to change before he can even form an apology. Antlers pushing up through his hair, his neck lengthening, his hunter's cry catching in a throat no longer shaped for words. He turns to run and finds 4 legs beneath him instead of 2. Below in the trees, his own hounds pick up a scent they know as prey, not master, and give chase with the same loyalty they have always shown him. He cannot call them off. He cannot tell them anything at all. His companions, still hunting nearby, hear the pack finally catch something and cheer them on, wondering aloud where Actaeon has gotten to. 12 thrones, once empty on a cloud-wreathed summit, are filled now, Zeus and Hera at the head. Poseidon still sulking faintly about a flood, no one has quite let him forget. Athena and Apollo and Artemis and Hermes and Aphrodite and Ares and Hephaestus and Demeter and Dionysus, arranged around a table set for a family that did not so much choose each other as inherit one another through birth, rivalry, and grudging necessity. It looks from a distance like order finally achieved. The Golden Age Cronus once ruled traded for something sharper and stranger, a household of tempers held in a fragile working balance. Zeus sits at the center of it pretending, as he always does, that he is the one holding it together, that the flattery and the flooding and the flaying and the boasting are all somehow accounted for under his rule. He does not mention the warning still waiting on a chained Titan's lips, nor the wedding not yet held on a distant coast. The table is set. The gods are seated. Nothing about this is as settled as it looks. 12 thrones stood filled on Olympus, and the gods had allowed themselves, for one held breath, to imagine the danger was behind them. It was not. Deep in the earth, Gaia had watched her Titan children dragged in chains to Tartarus, and grief curdled into fury, patient and total. She turned to Tartarus, the pit itself, and out of that final coupling she bore the last and most terrible of her children, Typhon, a storm given a body. He rose from the earth taller than any mountain, his shoulders sprouting not arms but 100 serpent dragon heads, each mouth spitting fire, hissing in the voices of every beast that had ever drawn breath, the roar of a lion, the bark of a hound, the bellow of a bull, all pouring from one throat and then another. Where his legs should have been, coiling vipers writhed instead. And when he stood to his full height, his head brushed the stars and his hands could reach from one horizon to the other. The other gods gathered on Olympus felt the mountain itself begin to shudder, and for the first time since the Titans fell, real fear moved through their ranks. Some, it is said, fled as far as Egypt and took the shapes of animals to hide. Only Zeus stood his ground. He met Typhon on slopes where earth and sky seemed to be tearing apart, thunderbolt in hand, and the battle that followed scorched forests to ash and boiled rivers dry. In one telling, Typhon nearly overcame him, wrenching the sinews from Zeus's own limbs and leaving him helpless until Hermes and Pan stole them back in secret. But the king of the gods would not be unmade. Bolt after bolt found their mark, until Typhon's 100 throats screamed as one and his burning bulk crashed to earth. Zeus drove him down, until the storm son of Gaia was pinned beneath the whole weight of Sicily, under Mount Etna, where to this day the ground still trembles and fire still climbs from the vents, Typhon's breath, buried but never quite silenced. Somewhere below the roots of the ordinary world, in a country the sun has never once touched, 5 rivers thread the dark and mark its true geography. The Styx is the eldest and gravest of them, black and utterly cold, the water by which even the gods themselves must swear their most binding oaths. To break a promise sworn on the Styx is to invite a year of speechless, breathless punishment. Lethe winds beside it, gentler in sound but crueler in effect, for whoever drinks from its slow current forgets everything they were, name and face, and every love they carried down with them. Acheron, the river of woe, carries the newly dead toward the ferry. Cocytus wails with a sound like weeping, though there is no wind to make it. And Phlegethon burns, an impossible river of fire that lights the whole dark country from beneath, throwing a red and restless glow across water that should never burn at all. In a hollow cave far from any road a mortal has ever walked, something ancient broods in the dark, half of her lovely beyond describing, and half of her something else entirely. This is Echidna, and the poets who first sang of her could not decide whether to call her a nymph or a horror, so they made her both at once. From the waist up, a woman with bright cheeks and dark, quick eyes, the kind of face that could belong to any maiden gathering water at a well. From the waist down, a serpent's coiling body, scaled and immense, dragging across the cave floor without ever needing legs to carry her. She does not age. She does not die of any ordinary cause. She keeps to her hollow, rarely seen even by other gods, and there she has borne to Typhon, the storm son who nearly unmade Olympus. a brood that will trouble heroes and haunt travelers for generations to come. Every monster that follows in this telling traces its blood back to this one hidden cave. At the very edge of the known world, past every last landmark a sailor could name, a garden grows that does not belong to mortal geography at all. Here the Hesperides, daughters of evening, tend a single tree whose apples are pure gold, a wedding gift once given to Hera herself. And coiled around that tree's trunk, looping trunk and branch in scale after gleaming scale, is Echidna's last and most patient child, a serpent dragon whose eyes never once close, whose great body never once slackens, who has not slept a single hour since the tree was planted. Sailors who have glimpsed the garden from a safe distance say the coils shimmer faintly even in moonlight, 100 rings of muscle wound tight around gold. No hero has yet come close enough to test that watchfulness. When one finally does, it will take more than courage. It will take a plan clever enough to close eyes that were built never to shut. Past asphodel, past the rivers, past even the growl that waits in the dark just beyond them, the true underworld begins at a threshold of black iron. Gates cast so long ago that no smith living or dead remembers their forging. They do not creak. They do not need to be guarded from outside, for nothing outside wants to come in uninvited, and everything inside understands, without being told twice, the single rule that governs this whole silent country. The dead may pass through freely in an endless patient procession, but no living foot has ever crossed back over that threshold and left an untroubled print behind it. The gates stand open more often than closed. They have never once needed to be shut by force. Something waits just inside the iron gates, in the last stretch of dark before the underworld proper begins, and travelers who have heard it, for almost no one has truly seen it and lived to describe it clearly, speak only of the sound. A growl that seems to come from 3 throats at once, low and constant, more felt through the ground than heard through the air. Eyes catch what little light there is and throw it back, doubled, tripled, watching from angles that should not be possible for a single creature to hold at once. It does not trouble those who are already dead. They walk past it without a glance, and it lets them. It exists for one purpose only, patient as the gates themselves, to make certain that whatever crosses into this country in life does not simply turn around and walk back out again. On the road into Thebes, there is a crag where a single traveler at a time is forced to stop, whether they wish to or not, because the creature that has made this rock her throne will not permit anyone to pass unquestioned. She has a woman's face, calm and almost kind if you do not look too long, framed by a mane where hair should be. Below that face, a lion's body coils in weight, muscled and immense, and from her shoulders a pair of great wings rise, folding and unfolding with a patience that is somehow worse than hunger. She asks every traveler the same riddle. What walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 at midday, and 3 in the evening? Those who answer wrong, and almost all of them do, she seizes in an instant, wings snapping open, and does not let go again. The road below her crag is littered with the bones of men who thought a riddle could not possibly be worth dying over. Thebes has grown afraid to send its own citizens that way at all, and the throne on the rock stays occupied, waiting for someone clever enough, or desperate enough, to finally answer right. Persephone was gathering flowers, the way she had gathered flowers every spring of her young life, with her mother's blessing and her mother's whole attention rarely far off. She wandered a meadow thick with crocus and violet and hyacinth, her arms already full, her bright hair loose and catching the sun, when something caught her eye that she had never seen growing anywhere before. A narcissus of impossible size, 100 blooms springing from a single root, its fragrance so sweet that the whole sky and earth seemed to smile at the scent of it. She did not know, how could she have known, that the flower had been planted there deliberately, a lure grown at Zeus's own quiet word, a gift arranged in advance for a bridegroom she had not yet met and had certainly never agreed to. She reached for it with both hands, delighted. Her companions, the Oceanids, scattered around her in the same meadow, all of them young, all of them careless in the particular way that only the safe and the beloved can afford to be. Her fingers closed around the stem, and the ground beneath her, without any warning at all, without so much as a tremor to announce itself first, began to open. The earth did not simply crack open. It split as though it had been holding its breath for this one instant, and could finally let it out. From the widening dark below, 4 black horses surged upward, dragging behind them a chariot of iron, and at its reins stood Hades himself, not some fanged horror out of a later age's nightmares, but a grave, pale king in a black robe, his face set with the terrible calm of someone who has already decided how this will go and sees no reason to raise his voice about it. He crossed the meadow in 3 strides of his chariot's wheels. Persephone had time to scream once, a single cry that the Oceanids would later swear they heard but could not place, echoing off no particular direction, gone before they could even turn. Hades's arm closed around her, and the narcissus blooms she had been holding scattered across the grass, already wilting, already forgotten by everyone but her. The chariot did not slow. It plunged straight back into the widening dark, wheels striking sparks off stone that had not existed a moment before, and the earth closed itself again behind them with the same silent totality it had opened with, no seam, no scar, no sign at all that anything had happened here except a drift of dropped flowers and a silence where a girl's voice had been. Demeter searched. She searched the way only a mother who has lost a child searches, which is to say without pause, without sleep, without any patience left for the ordinary courtesies of a goddess's dignity. She wrapped herself in the plain, dark clothes of an old woman and walked every road on earth, asking every traveler, every shepherd, every king's gatekeeper the same question, and getting the same useless silence in return, because almost no one had seen what happened, and the one god who had Helios, watching from his sun chariot above, had not yet been asked directly. Wherever her search led her, wherever her feet actually stopped moving, the ground beneath them simply stopped answering to her care. Wheat that should have been rising stayed folded in the earth. Orchards that should have been heavy with fruit stood bare and confused, their branches reaching for a season that refused to arrive. Cattle grew thin in fields gone the color of ash. Mortals began, for the first time since the world was young, to starve, not from any war or plague, but from the simple absence of a goddess's attention, her whole vast power to make things grow bent entirely toward finding one daughter instead. Olympus itself began to notice the smoke of unburnt sacrifices rising thinner and thinner from below, and even Zeus, who rarely troubled himself over a mother's grief, understood that a world with no harvest in it was a problem that could not be ignored much longer. Zeus, unable to bear the sight of a starving earth any longer, sent word down through Hermes. Persephone would be released, on the single condition that she had eaten nothing at all during her time below. It should have been a simple test to pass. The dead do not eat. There had been no reason for her to break that fast, grief-stricken and closely watched as she was. But Hades, who had grown to want her beside him not merely as a captive but as a queen, was not without his own quiet cunning. Before Hermes arrived to lead her back up into the light, Hades offered her a pomegranate. Its skin split open to show the seeds glistening dark red inside, and told her, gently enough, that she need not go hungry on the journey. She took 7 of the seeds and ate them, one by one, not yet understanding, or perhaps understanding perfectly well and choosing it anyway, that the underworld does not release what it has fed. When Hermes came, the seeds were already sitting inside her, small and irreversible, a debt sworn in fruit rather than words. It was enough. Not enough to keep her below forever, but enough to bind her to that dark country in a way no unlocked gate could undo. She would go back up to her mother. But she would come back down again every year, for exactly as many months as she had swallowed seeds. The dispute came to Olympus because no one else had the standing to settle it. Demeter would not relent. She wanted her daughter back whole, entirely forever, and had already shown the world exactly what she was willing to let starve while she waited. Hades would not relent either, and for once had the law of the underworld itself on his side. 7 pomegranate seeds eaten was 7 pomegranate seeds eaten, and no god, however furious, could simply pretend a broken fast away. Zeus listened to both sides in the hall on Olympus, his iron-gray beard unmoving, his cloak the color of a coming storm, and understood that there was no version of this ruling that would leave both his brother and his sister-in-law's grief satisfied. So he split the difference the only way that could hold. For a portion of the year equal to the seeds she had swallowed, Persephone would remain below as Hades's queen in full right and authority. Not a prisoner any longer, but a ruler in her own hall. For the rest, she would return to her mother, and the earth would answer to Demeter's joy the way it had once answered to her grief. Flowers pushing up through soil that had lain bare, wheat rising gold in fields that had stood empty. It was not the ruling either goddess had wanted. It was the one that could actually be enforced. And so winter and spring were written into the world's calendar as law rather than accident. The first time grief and joy had ever been given fixed, recurring seasons of their own. She does not enter the underworld anymore as someone dragged. When Persephone crosses back down each year, she comes as what the ruling on Olympus made official, and the dark country itself had already quietly understood. Not a captive kept against her will, but a queen returning to a throne that is unmistakably hers. She sits beside Hades in the great hall with a crown of her own, her spring colors folded away and put aside for the months she spends below, replaced by something graver, more composed, dark robes suited to a country with no sun, a bearing that commands the same silence from the dead that her husband's does. The souls that pass before that dark throne, the newly arrived and the long-settled both, bow to her exactly as they bow to him, and there is no hesitation in it, no sense that her authority is somehow the lesser or the borrowed half of the pair. She judges alongside him. She receives petitioners alongside him. The Furies, who answer to few, answer to her word as readily as his. It took an abduction and a bargain sealed in fruit to bring her to this hall in the first place, and no telling of the story pretends otherwise. But the woman who sits that throne now is not the girl who was gathering flowers in a bright meadow with her friends. She rules a silent country with a settled, deliberate authority, and when spring calls her back up to her mother, something in that dark hall goes quiet until she returns. Each spring, when Persephone climbs back up into daylight and mother and daughter meet again on the surface of the earth, the whole world answers with a violence of green that no other season can match, flowers pushing through soil that had frozen, herds fattening on grass that seemed to grow visibly by the hour. But Demeter's gratitude for that reunion did not stay locked inside her own joy. Traveling in her old woman disguise during the worst of the searching months, she had been sheltered by the people of Eleusis, who took in a strange, grieving old traveler without knowing who she truly was, and cared for her with nothing to gain from it. Demeter did not forget the kindness. Once her daughter was restored to her, she returned to Eleusis and taught its people something no other city on earth yet knew: the secret of the grain itself, how to plant it, how to nurse it through the seasons, how to bring a harvest up out of ground that would otherwise lie idle forever. Alongside the grain came rites, private, solemn, never to be spoken of outside the initiated, that would come to be called the Eleusinian mysteries, a promise whispered to every soul who kept them that even death, like winter, does not have to be the whole story. Not every soul that crosses the Styx is bound for punishment, and not every soul has earned any particular honor either. Most simply drift. Beyond the region where the wicked are tormented, and the region where the exceptional few feast in unbroken peace, there lies a wide, colorless country called Asphodel, named for the pale flowers that are the only thing that grows there. The souls that settle in Asphodel are the ordinary dead, neither remarkable in virtue nor remarkable in crime, the great unremembered middle of every generation that has ever lived and died. They move through the gray fields without much memory of who they were, and without much purpose in where they are going, shades among shades, waiting out an eternity that asks nothing of them at all. Tantalus stands in a pool of clear water up to his chin, and he is always thirsty, and the water will not let him drink. Every time he lowers his head to swallow, the pool recedes beneath him, draining away into the ground until nothing is left but wet mud at his feet, only to rise again, mockingly full, the instant he straightens back up and gives up trying. Above his head, branches heavy with ripe fruit, pears, pomegranates, sweet figs, hang close enough to touch, and he is always hungry, and the fruit will not let him eat. Whenever he reaches for it, a gust of wind he never sees coming lifts the branches just out of reach, and they do not settle low again until his arm has already dropped in exhaustion. This is his punishment for a crime almost too monstrous to say aloud. He served the gods his own son, Pelops, at a feast to test whether their divine knowledge could see through the deception. It could, and so he stands, forever between two impossible reaches, hungry and thirsty in the middle of abundance, for the rest of time. Sisyphus pushes his boulder up the slope of a hill inside the underworld, and he has been pushing it for longer than most of the dead around him have existed at all. He earned this particular eternity by being cleverer than death itself deserved to allow. Twice he tricked his way out of dying, once by chaining Thanatos, the very spirit of death, so that no one anywhere could die until the other gods forced his release, and once by convincing Hades to let him return briefly to the world above to scold his own wife for failing to bury him properly, then simply refusing to come back. The gods do not appreciate being outsmarted twice by the same mortal, so they gave him a labor with no possible completion, no reward waiting anywhere at its end. He gets the boulder almost to the crest of the hill, muscles straining, every single time, and every single time, one step from the summit, it slips from his grip and rolls all the way back down to where he started. He walks back down after it without a word. He has done this before. He will do it again. On the near bank of the Styx, the newly dead gather in a crowd that never quite thins, waiting their turn at a crossing that only one boat is permitted to make. Charon, the ferryman, is old beyond any ordinary reckoning of age, his face weathered to something closer to bark than skin, and he takes no soul across without payment. A single coin, traditionally placed under the tongue by whoever buried the body properly, and those who arrive without it are left to wander the near shore for 100 years before he will finally relent and carry them anyway. The pole he pushes against the black current has done this same motion so many uncounted times that the water itself seems to part for it out of habit rather than force. From the dark throne room beyond, where the walls are always cool and the torches burn low and steady, Hades and Persephone can watch the crossing without needing to leave their hall at all. A long, silent procession of the newly arrived, filing off the ferry and toward whatever judgment or rest awaits them, one boatload at a time forever. It is not a cruel sight to either of them, not after so long ruling here. It is simply the rhythm their country keeps, as steady and unbothered as a tide. Eurydice was newly married, still wearing the flowers from a wedding that had happened only hours before, when she stepped, without looking, into a patch of tall grass at the edge of a meadow her friends had been dancing through all afternoon. She never saw what her foot came down on. A serpent, coiled and hidden in the green, struck once at her ankle, and the poison did its work with a speed that gave her no time to even call properly for help. A stumble, a gasp, and she was on the ground before anyone nearby had fully understood what they were looking at. Orpheus, her husband of less than a day, reached her only moments after the venom had already finished its work, and found not a wife he could still save, but a wife he could only hold. The wedding songs that had been playing all afternoon went quiet one instrument at a time as the news passed through the gathered guests. He did not weep the way other men wept. He picked up his lyre instead, and for the first time in his life, he began to play as though the music itself might be able to argue with death. Orpheus did what no one else in the history of the world had thought to attempt. He went down into the underworld alive, uninvited, carrying nothing but his lyre. The dark country's own threshold guardian, who lets nothing living pass, heard the first notes of his playing and simply lay down, lulled into a stillness no leash or chain had ever managed. The souls in Asphodel paused their aimless drifting to listen. Even the tormented, Tantalus letting the water go untouched for once, Sisyphus setting his boulder down mid-push and leaving it to rest exactly where it stopped, turned toward the sound. Orpheus walked all the way to the dark throne, and there he played and sang before Hades and Persephone themselves, a song of a love he had lost only hours after finding it, a grief so raw and so beautifully made that even that grave, unmoved king felt something shift in his chest. And Persephone, who understood better than almost any god what it was to be taken from someone who loved you, wept openly on her throne. They granted his request. Eurydice's shade would follow him back up through the long, dark passage to the world above, on one single condition, spoken plainly and without room for negotiation. He must not look back at her, not once, not until they had both fully crossed into daylight. He agreed instantly, desperately, and began the climb. Behind him, footsteps he could not quite hear, breathing he could not quite catch. Was she even there at all? The doubt grew with every step, a small cold thing tightening in his chest, until the first gray light of the upper world touched his face. And in that one unbearable instant of relief, before she herself had fully crossed the threshold, he turned to look. He saw her for half a heartbeat, already fading, already being pulled back down, her hand reaching for him one last time. And then she was gone, a second time, and this time there would be no bargain that could bring her back again. Orpheus climbed back into the daylight alone a second time, Eurydice gone for good and no god willing to grant a third chance. But grief was not the only force shaping heroes in Greece, and elsewhere a new danger was already taking root. Once a king of Argos heard a prophecy that his own grandson would kill him, and he did what frightened kings do. He locked his daughter Danae in a chamber of bronze, sealed from every man alive. It did not matter. Zeus came to her as a shower of gold pouring through the roof slats. And from that union, a son was born, Perseus, cast out to sea in a wooden chest with his mother, rather than risk the old king's wrath directly, and washed ashore on a fisherman's island where he grew to manhood believing his life would be a quiet one. It was not to be quiet. A tyrant king wanted Danae for himself and wanted Perseus gone, and so he set the boy an errand meant to kill him. Bring back the head of Medusa, the Gorgon whose gaze turns living flesh to stone. Anyone else would have died at the threshold. But Athena had watched this boy grow, and she came to him in the gray hour before dawn, helm crested, spear in hand, owl on her shoulder, the fringed aegis with its Gorgon mask hanging at her side, a fitting guide for the hunt to come. She sent him to the nymphs of the north for the tools no mortal hand could forge alone. Winged sandals to carry him over open air, a cap that would hide him from any eye, a curved sword that would not bend against scale or bone, and a shield polished to a mirror's shine. For she told him plainly that to look at Medusa directly was to die, and that he must learn to fight a monster by watching only her reflection. He found her at the world's western edge, in a garden of statues that had once been men, hunters and travelers who had made the same mistake Perseus was sworn not to make. Medusa slept among her two immortal sisters, and even sleeping she was terrible. A woman's shoulders and arms, a woman's stern beauty in what remained of her face, but where her hair should have fallen there was a live and hissing tangle of serpents, coiling and uncoiling against the stone. Perseus did not look at her. He raised the mirrored shield Athena had given him and watched the Gorgon's reflection instead, walking backward into her lair with his eyes fixed on bronze rather than flesh, guided by the goddess's own hand steadying his aim. When he was close enough, he did not hesitate. He swung the curved blade in one clean arc, and Medusa's head came away from her shoulders before her sisters had stirred. From the wound where her neck met the dust, two things sprang fully formed and blinking into the gray light, a winged horse and a giant with a golden sword, born of Poseidon's old union with her, back when she had been beautiful and cursed for it rather than monstrous. Perseus sealed the head in a satchel Athena had given him for that purpose alone, its power undiminished by death, and rose into the sky on his winged sandals before the sisters woke to find the garden one statue emptier and one sister gone. Flying home over a coastline he did not know, satchel heavy at his hip with a head that could still turn the living to stone, Perseus saw something chained to a sea cliff below him that at first he took for a statue among the rocks. It was a girl, wrists bound in iron, ankles lashed to the stone, left there by her own father as an offering. Her name was Andromeda, and her mother's boast that she outshone the sea nymphs had drawn the wrath of Poseidon down on her kingdom in the form of floods and a beast that now rose from the waves toward the cliff. Drawn by the promise of a meal it did not have to hunt, Perseus did not need to be asked twice. He came down out of the sky on his winged sandals, sword drawn, and met the creature in the shallows, striking again and again at its hide until the water ran red and it sank beneath the surf for the last time. He cut Andromeda free himself, and when her father, relieved and ashamed in equal measure, offered her hand in marriage as the only thanks he had to give, Perseus did not refuse. It was the first thing in his short, hunted life that had been given to him rather than survived. The old king who had locked his daughter in bronze had not escaped the prophecy by casting his infant grandson out to sea. He had only postponed it. Years later, Perseus, grown, married, a slayer of monsters with a Gorgon's head still coiled in his satchel, came home to compete in funeral games in a city he did not know was his grandfather's refuge, the old man having fled there long before out of the same fear that had started this whole chain of events. Perseus took his turn at the discus throw, and a gust of wind, or a god's hand, or simple chance sent the bronze disc wide of its mark and into the crowd of onlookers, where it struck an old man in the skull and killed him before anyone could cry out a warning. It was his grandfather. The prophecy that had cost Danae her freedom, cost Perseus his infancy at sea, and cost the old king every peaceful year he might otherwise have lived, closed itself in an instant no one had engineered and no one could have stopped. Perseus buried him with honor and could not, in the end, claim the throne that death had emptied for him. Grief and the shame of the thing sat too heavy on him for that, and he traded kingdoms with a cousin instead, ruling a different city for the rest of his days. From the raw wound where Medusa's neck had met Perseus's blade, something had sprung that the hero left behind him without a second glance, already rising into the sky on his own errand. It was a horse unlike any that had walked the earth before it, white-coated, powerful through the shoulder, and carrying from its back a pair of vast white wings that beat the dust of the Gorgon's garden into a swirling cloud as it found its feet for the first time. This was Pegasus, born not of mare and stallion, but of a monster's death and a sea god's old union with her, and he did not linger in that garden of stone victims. He beat his wings and climbed, faster than any bird, higher than any hawk, until the garden of the Gorgons was a gray smear far below, and the whole curved rim of the world lay open beneath him. Word of a winged horse loose over the earth traveled faster than the horse itself, reaching the ears of a young prince named Bellerophon in Corinth, a man with a gift for taming what could not be tamed and a destiny, though he did not know it yet, that this very horse would carry him straight into, and eventually, straight out of. Bellerophon wanted the horse the moment he heard of it, but wanting was not enough. Every hunter and prince from the coast had tried to run Pegasus down with rope and net and failed, for a horse that could outfly the wind does not tire the way a horse of earth does. Bellerophon slept one night at the altar of Athena, praying without much hope that the goddess who loved clever solutions might offer him one, and when he woke a golden bridle lay beside him on the temple stones, warm as though a hand had just set it down. He carried it to the spring where Pegasus came to drink, moving slow and unthreatening the way a man approaches a wild thing he means to keep rather than kill, and the horse, drinking, let him close the distance and slip the bridle over its head without a fight, as if it had been waiting for exactly this and no other rider. From that morning on, horse and hero were rarely apart, Bellerophon fair-haired and light-armored in his Corinthian helm, Pegasus beneath him white and vast-winged, the two of them a single silhouette against every sky he flew. A kingdom in Lycia was burning field by field, and no spear thrown from the ground had ever come close to the thing doing the burning. It went by the name Chimera, and it was not one animal wearing another's parts but three animals fused whole into a single body. A lion's head and forequarters roaring at the front, a goat's head sprouting from its spine and bleating its own separate cry, a serpent's tail lashing behind heavy enough to break a man's ribs on contact, and from the lion's throat came fire that no shield could turn. Every champion sent against it on foot had died before getting close enough to swing a blade. Bellerophon did not go on foot. He rode Pegasus high above the creature's reach, out past the range of its flame, and circled until the chimera's roar turned upward in fury at a target it could not touch. From that height, on a horse it could not follow into the air, Bellerophon put arrow after arrow into it. And when the beast reared and opened its lion's jaw to breathe fire skyward one last time, he drove a spear tipped with lead down its own burning throat, where the creature's fire melted the metal, and the molten lead did what no blade could. It killed the thing from the inside out. Long before he was a name Athens told stories about, Theseus was a boy who did not know his father, raised in a coastal town by a mother who would answer none of his questions until he was strong enough for the answer to matter. On the day she judged him ready, she led him to a boulder half buried at the edge of a field and told him to move it. He was young still, dark-haired, not yet built the way he would be, but he set his shoulder to the stone and heaved until it gave, rolling clear to reveal a hollow beneath it where a sword and a pair of sandals had lain hidden for as long as he had been alive. His mother told him then what she had never told him before. His father was Aegeus, king of Athens, who had left these two things behind on the night Theseus was conceived, with instructions that the boy should come to him only once he could lift the stone himself and carry both relics as proof of who he was. Theseus buckled the sandals, belted the sword, and set out for Athens by the dangerous overland road rather than the safe sea route, because he had already decided, before he had even left home, that he intended to arrive as someone worth remembering. Crete's queen Pasiphae had once been cursed by Poseidon into an unnatural desire for a magnificent bull, and what came of that shame was a creature no one in the palace could look at without flinching. A thing with a bull's head set on a man's powerful frame, standing upright on two legs but bellowing with a bull's throat, ravenous in a way no ordinary animal ever was. King Minos could not kill his own wife's child, so he had the inventor Daedalus build a labyrinth beneath the palace, with corridors so tangled that nothing put inside it, man or monster, could ever find its own way out again. And there the Minotaur was shut, fed on a grim tribute. 7 youths and 7 maidens sent from Athens every 9 years, sacrificed for a defeat Athens had suffered generations before. When the 3rd tribute came due, Theseus, newly arrived in Athens, newly acknowledged as the king's son, volunteered himself in place of one of the 14, over his father's frantic objection, determined to end the tribute for good or die trying where so many others already had. He sailed for Crete with the other doomed 13. The ship's sails dyed black for mourning, as they always were sent, because no one expected any of them to come home to change them. Minos had a daughter, Ariadne, and the moment she saw the newly arrived tribute ship's tallest passenger, she was undone by him in the particular, total way that only happens once in a life, if it happens at all. She went to Daedalus in secret. The same inventor who had built the maze her own half-brother now lived and killed inside, and begged him for some way to help the stranger survive it. Daedalus, who had built the labyrinth and therefore understood better than anyone alive what it would take to escape it, gave her a simple answer: a spool of thread, tied at the entrance and unwound behind you as you went deeper, so that when the killing was done, you would have a line to follow back out through corridors built specifically to make sure you never could. Ariadne carried the spool to Theseus in secret the night before the tribute was to be led in, pressed it into his hands, and asked for exactly one thing in return: that he take her away from Crete with him when it was over, away from a father and a half-brother's monstrous shadow both. Theseus swore he would, and meant it, standing in the torchlight with the thread already looped once around his wrist. Theseus went into the labyrinth with Ariadne's thread paying out behind him, and somewhere in its deepest turning he found the Minotaur waiting. And the fight that followed was short and brutal, and ended with the bull-headed thing dead on the stone floor and Theseus alive to follow the thread back out. The other 13 tribute youths gathered and freed behind him. He took Ariadne with him as he had sworn to, and they sailed together as far as the island of Naxos, where, depending on which telling you trust, either Theseus abandoned her sleeping on the shore out of his own cruelty, or a god claimed her for his own bride, and Theseus sailed on grieving a loss he had no say in. Either way, he sailed for Athens without her, and in his grief or his carelessness, he forgot the one instruction his father had given him before he ever left. Change the ship's black mourning sails for white ones if you live, so I will know from the cliffs before you have even landed. He did not change them. His father Aegeus stood watching from the heights above the harbor day after day, and when he finally saw the ship rounding the point still rigged in funeral black, he did not wait for confirmation. He threw himself from the cliff into the sea that has carried his name ever since, dead from a message his own son forgot to send. Greek sailors spoke of Colchis the way people speak of a place they are not certain still belongs to the world they know, a kingdom on the far eastern shore of the Black Sea, past which, they said, the charted world simply stopped and something older and stranger began. It sat at the mouth of a river that ran down from mountains no Greek had climbed, and in a sacred grove near the king's palace hung a fleece of solid gold, taken from a ram that had once carried 2 royal children to safety through the sky itself and been sacrificed there in gratitude. No one who had gone looking for that fleece had come back to say what guarded it, only that something did, and that the guarding had never once failed. In the city of Iolcus, a throne sat on shaky ground. King Peleus had taken it from his own half-brother by force, and a prophecy had long since warned him that a man wearing only one sandal would one day come to take it back. That man arrived at a festival years later, a young cousin named Jason, raised in secret by a centaur tutor after his father was driven from the throne, who had lost a single sandal crossing a river on his way into the city, and walked into the festival grounds not knowing or caring what the missing shoe meant to the man on the throne. Peleus recognized the sign at once and hid his fear behind a smile, greeting his young cousin warmly, and then, in the same breath, setting him an errand designed to make sure he never came back to collect what was rightfully his. Sail to the world's edge, to Colchis, and bring back the Golden Fleece. Jason, young and not yet wise to how such offers were usually poisoned, accepted it as an honor rather than a death sentence, and set about gathering a crew equal to a voyage no one had ever completed. Word went out across Greece that a ship was being built for a voyage to the edge of the known world, and the greatest names of a generation answered it before the keel was even finished. Heracles came, already famous for strength that made lesser heroes step back and give him room. Orpheus came with his lyre, less useful with a blade than any man aboard, but, as it would turn out, more valuable than most of them combined. Twin sons of the north wind came, men who could outrace storms. Atalanta, the huntress no man could outrun, very nearly joined them before Jason, wary of a woman aboard an all-male crew, turned her away, a decision more than one telling of this voyage treats as his first real mistake. The ship itself, Argo, was built under Athena's own guidance, its prow fitted with a beam of prophetic oak from her sacred grove at Dodona that could speak warnings in a human voice when the ship was in true danger. When the last hero had boarded and the last rope was cast off, 50 oars struck the water together, and the Argo slid out of Iolcus harbor and into open sea, carrying the largest gathering of heroes Greece had ever put in one hull. On an island along their route, the Argonauts found a blind old king named Phineus, starving in plain sight of food, his table set fresh at every meal and stripped bare or fouled with filth before he could raise a bite to his mouth. Phineus had once had the gift of true prophecy, seeing further into the future than any mortal was meant to, and the gods had punished the presumption of it by sending the Harpies, women's faces set on the bodies of carrion birds, taloned and screeching, wings beating up a stench of rot wherever they passed, to torment every meal he tried to eat for the rest of his life. Among Jason's crew were the 2 winged sons of Boreas, the north wind, and when the Harpies descended shrieking onto Phineus's table as they always did, the brothers launched into the air after them, faster on the wing than the creatures they chased, driving them shrieking out over open water until the Harpies fled for good and never returned to trouble the old king again. Phineus, free at last to eat a full meal, repaid the crew with the one thing he still had to give: the exact course through the deadly clashing rocks that lay between the Argonauts and Colchis. Every sailor who had ever passed a certain stretch of rocky coastline told the same story afterward, if they told any story at all, of a song so beautiful it made men forget their own names, forget the sea beneath their hull, forget everything except the need to steer toward the voices singing it, straight onto rocks already littered with the bones of everyone who had listened before them. The sirens sang from those rocks as the Argo drew near, and one by one the oarsmen's strokes began to falter, their eyes turning toward a shoreline that promised something none of them could name but all of them wanted. Orpheus did not try to block his ears or beg his crewmates to hold course. He lifted his lyre instead and played something louder, something more urgent and more beautiful than what was calling from the rocks, filling the ship's air with music that reached the oarsmen's ears first and loudest, drowning out the sirens' voices beneath his own. The crew rowed on, drawn back to their own rhythm by a song a living man had chosen to give them, rather than one that would have taken everything from them. And the Argo passed the rocks without losing a single man to them. They reached Colchis at last, the grove where the Golden Fleece hung glowing on an oak branch as though it had swallowed the sun itself, and coiled around the trunk beneath it was the thing that had turned back every attempt to take it. It was a serpent unlike any that lived in ordinary waters, longer than the tallest ship's mast, scaled in a dull metallic sheen that caught the torchlight in dead, cold flashes. And it did not sleep. Not once. Not ever. Its unblinking eyes tracking every shifting shadow in the sacred grove without pause, coil sliding over coil in a slow, ceaseless vigilance that had outlasted every hero who had come before this one. The serpent could not be fought. No blade had ever gotten close enough to try, and no army could outlast a guardian that never slept. What finally beat it was not strength but a princess. Medea, daughter of the Colchian king and granddaughter of the sun god Helios himself, was a sorceress of formidable and genuine power even before love ever entered into it. And the moment she saw the stranger from the Argo standing in her father's hall, something in her decided, with the same total certainty Ariadne had once felt for Theseus, that she would have him whatever it cost her. Jason, for his part, needed her badly and knew it, and whether what passed between them was love or calculation on his side hardly mattered to how the bargain was struck. She would give him the charm that could put the sleepless serpent under for the first time in its life, in exchange for his oath, sworn before the gods, that he would marry her and take her home to Greece as his wife. Jason swore it. Medea led him to the grove that night, and sang the guardian into a heavy, drugged sleep, with a potion drawn from roots no Greek hand had ever touched. And Jason lifted the Golden Fleece from the branch himself, while the serpent's coils lay motionless beneath it, for the first time anyone could remember. Jason kept his oath for years, long enough that he and Medea had 2 sons together in Corinth, where they settled after the voyage home and the long, blood-soaked homecoming that followed it. A homecoming Medea's own cunning had made possible more than once, at costs to her own family she never fully recovered from paying. And then, with a throne within reach through a new marriage to the Corinthian king's daughter, Jason set Medea aside. He told himself it was a practical match, a step up for their sons as much as for himself, and he seems genuinely to have believed he owed her nothing more than this, that the debt for everything her sorcery and her betrayal of her own father had bought him was somehow already settled. Medea did not see a practical match. She saw a promise sworn before the gods, broken by the one man she had given up a homeland and a family to keep it for. Her answer was not grief. It was total, deliberate ruin. She sent the new bride a wedding gift laced with poison that burned the girl alive the moment she put it on, and burned her father with her when he ran to hold her dying body. And then, with Jason's new marriage in ashes and his old family the only thing he had left in the world, Medea turned to the 2 sons she had borne him and took the blade to them herself, one after the other, in a killing that was not madness but the final, calculated stroke of a vengeance she had already decided would leave Jason with nothing at all, not a bride, not an heir, not even bodies to bury, since she would not grant him even that. When it was done, she did not flee like a hunted woman. She rose into a chariot drawn by dragons, a gift from her grandfather the sun, and flew from Corinth over Jason's head while he stood in the wreckage of everything he had, unable to reach her, unable to undo any of it. Daedalus had built the labyrinth that trapped the Minotaur, and when King Minos learned that Ariadne's stolen thread, the same thread that let Theseus escape it, had come from the inventor's own hands, Minos had Daedalus and his young son Icarus shut up together. Some tellings say in a tower, others in the labyrinth itself, guarded on every side by land and by sea so that no ship could carry them away. Daedalus, who had never in his life met a problem he could not build his way out of, looked at the one direction Minos had left unguarded, the open sky, and set to work. He gathered feathers shed by the gulls that circled the tower, largest to smallest, and bound them together with linen thread and wax softened by candle heat, shaping 2 great wings for himself and a smaller matching pair for his son, testing each one's balance and lift before he trusted either of them to hold a man's weight over open water. When both pairs were finished and fastened to their shoulders with leather straps, Daedalus gave Icarus the only warning that mattered before they leapt from the tower's edge. Fly a middle course, neither so low that the sea's damp would soak the feathers heavy, nor so high that the sun's heat would soften the wax that held them together. They leapt together and found the air held them, 2 men suddenly airborne where no man had ever flown unaided, and for a while it went exactly as Daedalus had planned, father and son beating steady wings side by side over the sea. Farmers and fishermen far below stopping their work to stare up at what they took for gods passing overhead. But Icarus was young, and the sky was intoxicating in a way his father's warning had not prepared him for. And the higher he climbed, the more the whole curved world seemed to open beneath him, farther and freer than anything he had known inside Crete's guarded walls. He forgot the middle course. He climbed, laughing, chasing the exhilaration of it, until he was close enough to the sun that the wax binding his feathers together began to soften, then to run, the careful stitching of his father's work coming apart one feather at a time in the heat. He did not notice until he was already falling, the wings gone ragged and useless around his arms, the sea rushing up to meet him far faster than it should have. Daedalus, turning at the sound of his son's cry, saw only scattered feathers drifting down through empty air where a moment before there had been a boy, and by the time he reached the water below there was nothing left to save. The sea that swallowed Icarus has carried his name ever since, a warning written into the map itself for anyone who forgets that a gift built by human hands has human limits. Zeus had fathered a son on a mortal woman named Alcmene, a boy meant from birth to be the greatest of all his children, and Hera, who had spent an eternity punishing every one of her husband's mortal lovers and every child that came of them, hated this particular infant with a special, focused fury, because she alone among them was fated to trouble her for the whole of his life. She sent 2 serpents into his crib in the dead of night, gliding silent over the nursery floor and up over the cradle's edge toward the sleeping twins inside, Heracles and his mortal half-brother both. His nurse found the household the next morning not in mourning but in astonishment. Heracles sitting upright in his crib, laughing, a strangled serpent crushed lifeless in each small fist, having woken to the threat and answered it with a baby's bare hands before anyone else in the house had even stirred. It was the first sign, if anyone had needed one, of exactly what kind of life this child was going to have, one where the goddess who should have protected an infant instead marked him for a lifetime of trials, and where his own strength, even before he could walk, would always be enough to survive what she sent, though never quite enough to make her stop sending it. Zeus had boasted before Heracles was even born that the child about to enter the world that day would rule over all his kin, and Hera, hearing the boast, saw a way to twist it against the very son it was meant to honor. She went to the goddess of childbirth and had her sit cross-legged in the doorway of Alcmene's chamber with her fingers laced tightly together, a small, silent magic that froze Alcmene's labor at its hardest moment, and would not let the child be born no matter how far past its time the agony stretched. At the same hour, in a different house, a weaker cousin named Eurystheus lay only 7 months in his own mother's womb, and Hera hurried his birth along so that he slipped into the world first, technically the elder of the two by the barest margin the goddess's trick could manage. Only after Eurystheus had drawn his first breath did Hera let the goddess of childbirth unlace her fingers and rise from the doorway, and Alcmene's labor resumed at once, Heracles born at last into a world where the throne his father had promised him now belonged, by the letter of a boast Zeus could not take back, to a cousin who would spend the rest of his life too frightened of Heracles' strength to ever look him in the eye, yet who held, by that one cruel accident of timing, the legal right to command him. Heracles had by manhood married Megara, a Theban princess he won by helping defend her city in its hour of need, and for a time he had exactly the ordinary happiness that his life had never otherwise allowed him. A wife, young children, a household of his own. Hera had not forgotten him. She reached into his mind and twisted it, sending a delusion so total and so convincing that the world around him rearranged itself in his sight into something it was not. His own home became, in the madness she poured into him, a battlefield crawling with enemies, and the small, familiar shapes of his wife and children became, to his ruined perception, hostile things that needed to be destroyed before they destroyed him. He did not fight a delusion and win. He fought it and lost completely, cutting down his own wife and his own sons with his own hands in his own house, the greatest strength in the world turned by a goddess's cruelty into the instrument of the one crime no strength should ever be used for. When the madness lifted, as suddenly and completely as it had come, Heracles came back to himself standing in the wreckage of his own home, weapons still in his hands, and understood in a single unbearable instant exactly what he had done, and that no delusion, however total, would ever make it not have happened. He did not defend himself or ask for pity. He went to the Delphic oracle of his own accord, because the horror in him demanded some penance heavier than grief alone could pay, and the oracle gave him one. He would serve his cousin Eurystheus, the same cousin whose throne Hera had stolen for him before either of them could walk, for as many years and as many labors as the king saw fit to set him, until the debt of that single morning was considered paid. Before the weight of Delphi's sentence ever settled on him, when he was still a young man just coming into the fullness of his strength and had not yet chosen a road for his life, Heracles found himself alone at a fork where two paths met, and two women were waiting for him there, though no ordinary traveler would have found company on that empty road. One called herself Vice, though she offered a gentler name for herself, and she promised him a life without hardship, pleasure without labor, reward without risk, every comfort laid before him if he would simply take the easier of the two paths and never look back at the harder one. The other called herself Virtue, and she promised him nothing soft at all, a life of unceasing labor, of danger faced rather than avoided, of glory earned inch by bloody inch rather than given freely. And she told him plainly that the road she offered was longer, steeper, and would cost him more than the other ever would. Heracles listened to both without interrupting, weighing a life of comfort against a life of consequence, and then he did what would define everything that came after him. He turned from Vice's easier road without a backward glance and set his feet on Virtue's harder one, choosing, before fate had even forced the choice on him through Hera's madness and Delphi's penance, the kind of life that would make his name outlast his own bones. Eurystheus had waited his whole life, since the accident of birth order that made him king over a man he could never have beaten in open combat, for a chance to use that authority against his cousin, and Delphi's sentence handed it to him outright. Heracles knelt before the throne in the penitent posture the oracle's judgment demanded, and Eurystheus, who could not meet his eyes even now, even with the greatest hero in Greece kneeling in submission before him, some old animal instinct in him, still recognizing exactly how much stronger the kneeling man was, unrolled a list of labors chosen not for their usefulness, but for their impossibility, each one selected in the hope that this particular task, surely, would finally be the one that killed him. There was a lion whose hide no weapon could pierce, a serpent that grew two heads for every one severed, a stag no hunter had ever run down, birds with feathers of bronze, a boar that had terrorized a mountain for years, stables fouled by 1,000 cattle in a single day, a bull maddened on Crete, horses that ate the flesh of guests, a queen's girdle guarded by an army of warrior women, cattle guarded by a giant and a two-headed hound, apples guarded at the world's western edge, and worst of all, a three-headed hound that guarded the gate of the dead itself. Eurystheus read the list aloud in a voice that shook slightly despite the safety of his own throne, and Heracles rose from his knee without a word of complaint, because whatever the list cost him, it was still lighter than what he already carried. The first labor sent him to Nemea, where a lion the size of a bull's herd had been dragging shepherds and their flocks alike into its cave for years, its hide thick enough that no arrow had ever so much as scratched it and no spear had ever found purchase. Heracles learned this the hard way, loosing shaft after shaft that glanced off the lion's pelt as though he were shooting at solid bronze. The beast barely troubled enough to turn its head toward the irritation. He set down the bow. The cave the lion sheltered in had two mouths, and Heracles blocked one with stone before entering through the other, cutting off the beast's only escape and forcing the fight to happen on his terms rather than the lion's. What followed was not a contest of blade against hide, because no blade had ever worked against this animal and none would work now. Heracles got his arms around the lion's throat instead, bare skin against a pelt no weapon could cut, and held on through the animal's full, furious strength until the great cat's struggling slowed, then stopped, choked to death by nothing but a man's grip. He skinned it afterward using one of its own claws, the only blade sharp enough to part that hide. And from that day, the Nemean lion's pelt became his own, worn over his shoulders and head as both trophy and armor, a covering no weapon could pierce any better against him now than it had against the lion that once wore it. The first true mark of the hero the labors were beginning to make of him. The second labor took him into a swamp near Lerna, where the hydra coiled in the mud and the reeds, a serpent with no human anatomy anywhere in its body, its single trunk splitting upward into many separate snake heads, each one venomous enough to kill with a graze, its scales slick with a poison so potent that even the creature's blood and breath alone could kill a man who came too close. Heracles struck the first head from its neck with his sword, expecting the fight to end there, and instead watched in real time as two new heads split up from the stump before the first one had even finished falling, the wound multiplying the very danger it was meant to end. He could not win this by cutting alone. Every stroke made the problem worse rather than smaller. His nephew Iolaus, driving the chariot that had brought them, saw what was happening and grabbed a burning torch from their fire, and the two of them worked out a new method between them without needing to discuss it twice. Heracles struck each head free in turn, and the instant the wound was open, Iolaus seared the raw stump shut with fire before it had the chance to grow back doubled. Head after head fell to that same brutal rhythm, strike and sear, until only the Hydra's one immortal central head remained, which could not be killed by any blade at all. Heracles severed it anyway and buried it, still writhing, under an immense boulder too heavy for even that undying malice to shift. And before he left the swamp, he dipped his arrows in the creature's poisoned blood, arming himself for every labor still to come with a venom that no wound would ever fully heal from again. A flock had settled over a lake near Stymphalus that no shepherd or farmer in the region would go near anymore, for these were not ordinary birds. Their feathers were sharpened bronze that they could loose like arrows on anyone who came within range, their beaks strong enough to pierce armor, and they had grown fat and vicious on a diet of human flesh taken from anyone unlucky enough to wander too close to their roost. Heracles could not simply wade into the reeds after them, since the marsh around the lake was too soft to hold a man's weight and too thick with undergrowth to let him get within striking distance of the flock before they scattered skyward and rained bronze feathers down on him from above. Athena solved the problem before he had to, sending him a pair of bronze rattles forged by the smith god himself, or so the story is told, and Heracles climbed a rise above the lake's edge and shook them together with all his strength. The sound was harsh and metallic, and utterly unlike anything the birds had ever heard near their roost, and it startled the entire flock into the air at once. A black bronze cloud rising screeching off the water in blind panic. Heracles, bow already strung, brought down bird after bird as they wheeled overhead in confusion, and the survivors, having learned in one terrifying morning that this lake was no longer safe, scattered for distant shores, and never returned to trouble Stymphalus again. One of the later labors sent him to the far western edge of the world, to a garden guarded by nymphs called the Hesperides, where a tree grew golden apples that belonged, by ancient right, to no mortal hand. And coiled around that tree, never blinking, never resting, was the serpent Ladon, a guardian as tireless as the one that had once watched the fleece at Colchis. Heracles did not go to that garden to fight the serpent himself. He went instead to find Atlas, the Titan condemned since the war of gods and Titans to hold the entire dome of the sky on his own shoulders at the world's western rim, because Atlas was the father of the Hesperides and the only being who could ask them for the apples without a fight. Heracles made him an offer. If Atlas would fetch the apples himself, Heracles would take the sky's full weight onto his own shoulders for as long as the errand took. Atlas agreed almost gladly, setting the crushing burden down onto Heracles for the first time in an age uncounted, and strode off toward the garden lighter than he had felt in centuries, leaving Heracles alone beneath a weight that bent even his enormous frame toward the earth. Atlas returned with the golden apples in hand, but freedom had given him ideas. He suggested, almost lazily, that he might simply deliver the apples to Eurystheus himself and leave Heracles to hold up the sky permanently in his place. Heracles, thinking faster than the offer deserved, agreed at once, but asked Atlas to take the sky back just long enough for him to pad his shoulders against the weight. The moment Atlas took the sky's burden back onto his own shoulders to allow it, Heracles picked up the apples from the ground and walked away, leaving the Titan exactly where duty had always kept him. The last and hardest labor Eurystheus set him was the one meant, more than any of the others, to finally kill him. Descend into the underworld itself and bring back Cerberus, the three-headed hound that guards the gate of the dead, without weapon and without harming the beast, using nothing but his own bare strength. Hades granted him permission on one condition, that Heracles use no weapon at all, relying only on his hands. And with that grudging blessing, Heracles went down through the gates of the dead and found the hound waiting where it always waits. 3 canine heads on one enormous four-legged body, a serpent's tail lashing behind it, each of the 3 throats capable of a bark that could stop a mortal heart outright. Heracles did not run from it. He wrapped both arms around its middle body and held on through the thrashing of 3 separate heads snapping at him from every angle, absorbing bites from jaws that would have killed any lesser man outright, until the beast's enormous strength finally gave out against his own, and it went still in his grip, subdued rather than slain. He hauled Cerberus bodily up through the gate of the dead and into the daylight of the living world, dragging a creature that had never once crossed that threshold before, and paraded it in chains before Eurystheus, who, by every account, took one look at the 3-headed horror standing in his own courtyard and begged Heracles to take it straight back down where it belonged, the labors finally, at long last, complete. On his way back from the garden of the Hesperides, long before the final labor with Cerberus, Heracles' road had carried him through the Caucasus Mountains, past a crag where a familiar figure hung chained to the rock in full view of the sky he had once defied, Prometheus, still bound there after an age uncounted, an eagle descending each day without fail to tear open his side and feed on his liver, which grew back whole by nightfall only to be torn open again the next morning, an endless, renewing agony inflicted for the crime of giving fire to mankind. Heracles had heard the old story since childhood, the same one every hero of his generation had grown up hearing, but hearing it and standing beneath the actual chained figure, still breathing after all that time, were entirely different things. He did not ask Zeus's permission. He strung his bow the moment he saw the eagle stooping toward its daily meal and put an arrow through it in mid-descent, the bird falling dead before its talons ever reached Prometheus's ribs again. Then he set to work on the chains themselves, forged for eternity and unbreakable by any ordinary hand, and broke them anyway through sheer strength and the same relentless persistence that had already choked a lion and worn down a hydra, striking the shackles from Prometheus's wrists and ankles one at a time, until the Titan who had suffered for humanity's sake finally stood free of the rock that had held him since before Heracles was even born. Atalanta had been left exposed on a mountainside as an infant, her father wanting a son and having no use for a daughter, and she had been raised instead by a she-bear, and later by hunters who found her running wild among the hills and taught her the bow. And what she learned from that upbringing made her faster on foot than any man in Greece, a huntress whose speed had already outrun boars and rivals, both by the time she was grown. She wanted no husband, and said so plainly to every suitor who came asking, but her father's insistence eventually forced her into a compromise she was confident would never actually cost her anything. Any man who wished to marry her would have to outrun her in a foot race, and any man who lost the race would die for the failure, terms harsh enough that she assumed they would end the matter for good. Suitor after suitor tried and lost and paid the price, until one named Hippomenes came to the starting line with a plan instead of just hope: 3 golden apples, a gift from Aphrodite herself, which he dropped one at a time along the race's course. Atalanta, faster than him by a wide margin, could not resist stooping to gather up each glinting apple as it rolled across her path, and the seconds lost to that small vanity, repeated 3 times, were enough for Hippomenes to cross the finish line just ahead of her, winning by a margin no honest race would ever have given him. Years after the 12 labors were behind him, Heracles took a wife named Deianira, and their journey together carried them to a river crossed only with the help of a centaur ferryman named Nessus, who offered to carry Deianira across on his back while Heracles swam the current himself. Partway across, Nessus tried to assault her, and Heracles, still in the water, shot him through the chest with one of the arrows he had long ago dipped in the Hydra's poisoned blood, a wound no creature survived. Nessus, dying, found one last cruelty to leave behind him. He told Deianira with his final breaths that his own blood, gathered now from the wound and kept in secret, was a powerful love charm, and that if she ever feared Heracles' love for her fading, a robe soaked in it would win him back completely. Deianira believed him and kept the blood, not knowing it was poisoned twice over, first by the Hydra's venom that had killed the centaur, and second by his own dying malice. Years later, hearing rumors that Heracles had taken an interest in another woman, she sent him a robe she had secretly soaked in that blood, believing she was binding his heart back to hers. Heracles put it on for a sacrifice, and the moment his own body's heat warmed the fabric, the poison woke, fusing the robe to his skin and burning through flesh and muscle both, an agony so total that tearing the garment away tore his own skin with it. Deianira, learning what her gift had actually done, could not live with the horror of it and took her own life before Heracles' suffering had even ended. The poison would not kill him quickly and would not let him live, and Heracles understood, in the last clear thinking left to him through the agony, that no labor and no strength was going to save him from this one. He had his men carry him up Mount Oda, and there, still burning from the inside with a poison that would not finish its work, he ordered a great pyre built and had himself laid on top of it while he still had the will to give the command, unwilling to let the poison finish him slowly when he could choose the manner of the end himself. No one among his own men would light it, out of love for him and horror at what they were being asked to do, until a young shepherd named Philoctetes finally agreed, and was given Heracles' own bow and poisoned arrows as payment for the mercy. A gift that would matter again, years later, at the walls of a city not yet built when this labor was finished. The flames took the pyre and rose around him, and as the fire consumed the mortal body that had carried a lion's pelt and dragged Cerberus into daylight, something in the smoke lifted clear of the burning wood entirely. What rose out of that fire was no longer only a man. Zeus had watched his son's whole hard life from Olympus. The madness Hera sent him, the 12 labors, the poisoned robe that finished what the goddess's hatred had started long before, and in the end he judged that the debt of suffering had been paid in full. Heracles was carried up to Olympus on the smoke of his own funeral pyre, and made a god outright, given a seat among the Olympians, and, at last, a peace that his mortal life had never once allowed him. While Demeter searched the whole grieving earth for her stolen daughter Persephone, wandering disguised and heartsick through every corner of the world, Poseidon saw her in her wandering, and undeterred by her grief, desired her the way he had desired so many before. Demeter, wanting nothing to do with him and desperate to be left alone with her mourning, transformed herself into a mare and hid herself among a mortal king's grazing herd, hoping to vanish into the anonymity of an ordinary animal until Poseidon lost interest and moved on to easier company. It did not work. Poseidon saw through the disguise at once, and rather than abandon the pursuit, he simply matched it, taking the shape of a stallion himself and running her down among the herd on the fields of Arcadia, pursuing her across open country until his purpose was accomplished despite everything she had done to prevent it. Demeter's fury at the assault never fully cooled, and some tellings say she spent an age afterward refusing to wash the anger from herself, earning a darker title among the local people for the rage that clung to her long after. But the union was not without its strange gift. From that pursuit across the Arcadian fields came, or so some tell it, a horse of the ordinary, earthbound kind, a creature born of a god's relentless desire and a goddess's failed disguise, running free across the world while its mother's grief for her daughter still had a great deal further left to run. Years before, when Prometheus still hung chained to his rock, he had told Zeus of a prophecy no other being alive knew, that the sea nymph Thetis, whom Zeus desired above any other, was fated to bear a son greater than his own father, a son who could unmake even the king of the gods the way Zeus had once unmade Cronus and Cronus had once unmade Uranus before him. Zeus had heard that warning and withdrawn from her at once, unwilling to risk the same fall he had once dealt his own father, and had given Thetis instead to a mortal man, a hero named Peleus, so that whatever extraordinary son she bore would be born a mortal too dangerous only to the ordinary world, and never to Olympus itself. Now, on the far side of the sea from where Heracles' pyre had only recently gone dark, that very marriage was finally being celebrated. A wedding feast gathering gods and mortals both under one roof to honor the match Zeus's own fear had arranged. The guest list drawn up with the kind of care that comes from knowing exactly how much can go wrong when immortal pride is seated too close together at a single table. Nearly every god who mattered had been invited and meant to come. Zeus himself, iron-gray bearded, storm cloud cloak thrown back from his bare chest and arms, an eagle circling somewhere above the gathering hall, thunderbolt banked and quiet in his hand for once, walked the threshold of the feast in the easy mood of a father pleased with how neatly an old danger had been diffused. He did not yet know, standing there in that moment of satisfaction, that one name had been left off the guest list, a deliberate insult to a goddess no one wanted at a wedding, and that the uninvited guest was already on her way, carrying with her a single golden apple that would undo, in one thrown gesture, every careful year Zeus had spent keeping this exact family safe from exactly this kind of catastrophe. On the slopes above the sea, at the wedding no one on Olympus would miss, Peleus took the sea nymph Thetis for his bride, the very match Zeus himself had once desired, and given up rather than risk a prophecy of a son mightier than his father. Every god came bearing gifts, golden cups, a spear that would never miss its mark, horses that could outrun the wind. Every god but one, Eris, goddess of discord, had been left off every invitation, turned away at every threshold, and she did not forgive an insult easily. She did not force her way through the doors. She simply rolled a single golden apple across the feasting floor, inscribed with 4 words no one at that table could ignore. To the fairest. It came to rest among the wine cups and the wedding garlands, small and bright and perfectly ordinary to look at, and for a moment nobody moved. Then 3 hands reached for it at once, Hera's, Athena's, Aphrodite's, and the laughter of the wedding guests died in their throats. No one at that table understood yet what they were holding. A single piece of fruit, no larger than a fist, and inside it already waiting, a war that would empty the halls of 2 continents and end the age all of them were born into. Every stone in Troy's high wall was laid by hands that were not entirely mortal. When Poseidon and Apollo defied Zeus and paid for it with a year bound in servitude to King Laomedon, they built for him a city wall so cunningly fitted that no siege engine, no battering ram, no mortal army would ever tear it down by force. Laomedon, when the labor was finished, refused to pay the wage he had promised, and the gods who built the wall did not forget the debt, a grudge that would outlast the king himself and fall instead on his descendants. For generations the wall stood exactly as the gods had left it, unbroken, unbreached, a boundary that made Troy feel less like a city than a promise. It would take 10 years, a horse, and a lie to prove that a wall built by gods could still be walked through the front gate, if only someone thought to ask to be let in. On the wooded slopes of Mount Ida, a shepherd prince who did not yet know his own royal blood watched 3 goddesses descend out of a clear sky. Paris had been raised among sheep and shepherds, because a prophecy at his birth warned he would one day bring fire to his own city, and his father, King Priam, had ordered the infant exposed on the mountainside rather than risk it. He had lived, raised by a herdsman who found him, never told the whole of what he was. Now Hermes stood before him with the golden apple in hand, explaining, not unkindly, that Zeus himself had refused this judgment, too wise or too wary to choose a favorite among his own wife and daughters, and had passed the burden down to a mortal instead. Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite arranged themselves before him, each magnificent, each certain of her own claim, each waiting for his verdict with the patience of the powerful. Paris held the apple and understood dimly that whichever way he judged, someone divine would carry the grudge forever. He judged anyway. Every war has a room like this one in it, small and quiet, where the whole catastrophe is still just a decision waiting to be made. Hera spoke first, and the mountain around Paris seemed to dissolve into something larger. He saw armies on the march, tribute ships crossing calm seas loaded with gold, thrones bending the knee to thrones, power over all of Asia, hers to grant a mortal she judged wisely. It was a vision built to overwhelm a shepherd's imagination, and for a moment it nearly did. Then Athena stepped forward, helm catching the light, spear grounded beside her, and the mirage sharpened into something colder and more precise. Paris saw himself leading a Trojan army that could not lose, every battle already decided in his favor before the first spear was thrown. Wisdom enough to outthink any general who ever lived. Two goddesses, two entire futures, laid out before a boy who had never commanded so much as a flock beyond his own hillside. Paris looked at both visions the way a man looks at a debt too large to comprehend, and set them both aside, not because he doubted their power to deliver, but because a third goddess had not yet spoken, and something in him already suspected what she would offer would matter more. Aphrodite did not offer armies or wisdom. She offered Paris something smaller and far more dangerous. A woman, the most beautiful alive, she said, already grown, already breathing somewhere across the sea, waiting for a love she did not yet know was coming. She did not need visions of gold to make her case. She simply stood there, doves circling her shoulders, and let Paris imagine a face he had never seen. He handed her the apple without a second thought for the wife, the most beautiful woman alive already had, without asking her name, without wondering what a king across the water might do, when his marriage was casually promised away by a goddess to a shepherd he had never met. Aphrodite smiled and took the apple as her due, and somewhere in Sparta, a queen named Helen went on with an ordinary evening, unaware that her whole future had just been decided by a man she would never meet until the decision was already binding. It is a strange thing, how the largest wars begin with the smallest transactions. An apple for a promise for a face, and neither party bothering to ask what it would actually cost. 1,000 ships sat motionless at Aulis, sails hanging slack, and no wind came. Agamemnon, commander of the whole Greek expedition, had killed a stag in Artemis's own sacred grove and boasted, in his pride, that not even the huntress goddess herself could have made a finer shot. She heard him. The seer couches read the stillness of the sea for what it was, a goddess's fury, and only one price that would satisfy it. Agamemnon's own daughter, Iphigenia, must die on the altar at Aulis before a single ship could sail for Troy. He sent for her under a kinder lie, telling his wife Clytemnestra the girl was to be married to Achilles himself, and Iphigenia came to the camp in her bridal clothes, expecting a wedding. There was no wedding. She was led to the altar, and when her cries threatened to curse the sacrifice, a gag was pressed into her mouth so that not even her voice could travel to the gods who might have spared her. Her saffron robe slipped from her shoulders as the priests raised her above the stone, and Agamemnon, who commanded 1,000 ships and could not command his own grief, gave the order anyway and turned his face away as it was carried out. The wind returned before the blood had cooled, and the fleet sailed within the hour, as if the sea itself had only ever wanted the one thing. Clytemnestra did not sail with him. She stayed behind in Mycenae, and for 10 years, while her husband made himself famous at Troy, she kept his daughter's death exactly as fresh as the day it happened. A debt she intended, eventually, to collect in full. Years into a siege that had already outlasted anyone's patience, Helen climbed the ramparts of Troy to look down at the armies still killing each other over her. She had grown so used to the war being spoken of as hers that she rarely bothered to argue the point anymore. Below, the old men of Troy's council, men long past fighting themselves, men who had watched sons and grandsons die for a decade over this one dispute, saw her standing at the wall, and something in their anger simply stopped. It is no wonder one of them murmured that Trojans and Greeks have suffered so long for a woman like that. She is terrible to look at, like a goddess. Not forgiveness exactly, something closer to helplessness. The recognition that some kinds of beauty make a war feel almost reasonable, even as they know better, even as they can see the funeral pyres from where they stand. Helen said nothing to defend herself and nothing to accept the blame either. She simply watched the battlefield with the rest of them, a woman standing at the center of a catastrophe built in her name, wondering, perhaps, which of the men fighting below would still be alive by evening. When Agamemnon seized the daughter of Chryses, a priest of Apollo, and refused every offer of ransom for her release, the priest walked down to the shore and prayed to his god with a plainer request than usual. "Make them pay." Apollo answered. He came down from Olympus like nightfall, his silver bow across his back, and for 9 days he loosed his arrows into the Greek camp, not at men in battle, but at the camp itself, at mules first, then dogs, then men, an invisible plague spreading from tent to tent while the funeral pyres burned constantly along the shore. No sword could fight it. No wall could keep it out. On the 10th day, the seer Calchas finally named the cause aloud, at real risk to himself, and Agamemnon, furious at being humiliated in front of the whole army, agreed to return the girl. But his pride demanded a replacement, and he reached for something that belonged to someone else instead, not yet understanding that the plague he had just ended was the smaller of the two disasters his stubbornness was about to cause. Before Achilles could walk or speak, his mother Thetis carried him down to the black waters of the river Styx, the river that binds even the gods to their oaths, and held him by one heel as she dipped his whole small body beneath the current. Every part the water touched became untouchable. No blade would ever bite it. No arrow would ever pierce it. No wound would ever be more than a scratch on skin that had already died once and come back sealed against the world. Only the heel she gripped stayed dry, one small patch of him left as ordinary as any other child's, because a mother's hand, however loving, cannot hold a river and her own son at the same time. Thetis knew what she had made. A warrior who could walk through any battlefield in the world and come home whole, if he chose to come home at all. She did not know, or could not let herself know, that she had also made the single point through which the whole of him could still be reached. Achilles grew up strong and swift and golden beyond any boy his age, favored by his teachers, favored by fate itself in every visible way. And he wore his invulnerability the way other children wear confidence, without ever once being told, in so many words, exactly where it ended. In the stories told around Greek hearths for 1,000 years after, it was this single, unwatched inch of him that mattered more than everything the river had made unbreakable. Proof that even the gods' best protections are only ever as complete as the love and the grip behind them. Achilles knew something almost no other man at Troy knew about himself. He had been given an actual choice. His mother had told him, before the ships ever sailed, of two futures laid out for him like two roads diverging at his own front door. Down one road lay a long life, decades of it, a household, grandchildren, a slow and comfortable dying in his own bed in a homeland at peace, and a name that would fade from memory within 2 generations, the way most names do. Down the other lay Troy, a short, blazing arc of a life, ended young, ended violently, but sung about for as long as there were people left to sing anything at all. Most men, offered such a choice, would not have hesitated toward the first. Achilles was not most men. He stood at the fork in his own fate and felt the pull of the second path the way other men feel hunger. an appetite that had nothing to do with reason and everything to do with what kind of creature he had decided he was. He chose glory over years, chose to be remembered over being comfortable, chose, in effect, to die young on purpose long before any spear or arrow made the choice permanent. It is the choice that makes him the story he became, not the invulnerable skin, not even the rage that follows, but this. A young man standing at a crossroads, looking straight at his own death, and walking toward it because the alternative frightened him more. Forced by the plague and his own army's fury to give back the priest's daughter, Agamemnon could not simply lose face in front of every king and captain who had sailed under him. If he had to surrender his own prize, someone else would have to surrender theirs, and his eye settled on Achilles, the one warrior in the whole camp too valuable to easily punish, which made the insult sweeter to deliver. He sent men to Achilles' tent to take Briseis, the captive woman Achilles had claimed as spoils of an earlier raid, and had, by every account, come to genuinely care for. It was not a large theft by the standards of a war built on plunder. It was, however, a very public one, staged in front of the whole assembly specifically, so that everyone would see Achilles humiliated and understand exactly who commanded whom. Achilles let her go without drawing his sword, though the men closest to him swear his hand went to the hilt more than once before he mastered it. He did not fight for her in the moment. He simply walked back to his ships, sat down on the shore, and began deciding, in a silence far more dangerous than any shout, exactly how much the Greek army would come to regret this particular morning. Achilles did not merely sulk. He withdrew completely from the councils, from the battle line, from the war itself, and took his men, his ships, and his fury with him, leaving a gap in the Greek line the size of the single greatest warrior anyone present had ever fought beside. At first the other Greeks assumed the line would hold without him. It always had before, more or less. It did not hold. Hector and the Trojans, sensing the weakness the way an animal senses a wound, pressed the attack with a confidence they had not shown in years of stalemate, driving the Greeks back toward their own ships, back toward the sea they had sailed in on, back toward the real possibility of a total and humiliating defeat. Achilles watched all of it from a distance, sitting outside his tent within sight of the fighting, and did nothing. Messengers came to beg him back. Kings came to offer him treasure, apologies, even Briseis returned untouched. He refused every one of them. His anger was not a passing mood he would talk himself out of by morning. It was a decision, held as steadily as a spear, and he intended to let the whole army feel exactly what it cost to make him make it. The Trojans were winning the day, and the god of war himself had joined the fighting on their side, cutting down Greeks with the delight of someone who had never once cared which army he favored, only that the killing continued. Athena had had enough of watching her own soldiers die to satisfy her brother's appetite. She climbed into the chariot of the Greek hero Diomedes, made herself briefly invisible to Ares' eyes, and guided the mortal's spear arm herself as he drove the point directly into the war god's belly. Ares' scream tore across the battlefield loud enough that both armies stopped fighting to listen. A sound, the poets say, equal to 10,000 men shouting at once. He did not linger to fight through the pain. Wounded by a mortal weapon in a mortal's hands, humiliated in front of both armies he had been enjoying equally, Ares fled the field entirely, streaking back up to Olympus to complain to his father Zeus, who offered him almost no sympathy at all. A god of war being wounded by a spear was, to Zeus's mind, more or less the natural consequence of loving war as much as Ares clearly did. Aphrodite was not made for battlefields, and it showed the moment she stepped onto one. She had come down only to shield her mortal son Aeneas as he lay wounded among the fighting, wrapping him in a fold of her own robe to carry him clear of the spears, a mother's instinct, not a warrior's calculation. Diomedes, still flush with having wounded Ares and apparently unwilling to let a second Olympian leave the field unmarked, drove his spear forward again and caught her across the wrist, drawing a thin line of ichor, the pale blood of the gods, instead of red. Aphrodite dropped her son, more startled than hurt, and fled the battlefield weeping, not from the pain alone, but from the plain unfamiliarity of being made to feel small in a place built entirely for men who trained their whole lives for exactly this. She found her mother waiting on Olympus and wept in her lap like a child, and the other gods, watching, understood a little better than before which of them truly belonged on a battlefield, and which of them never had. Patroclus had watched the slaughter from beside Achilles for days, and he could not do it any longer. He was gentler than his friend, in the way second sons and constant companions often are, and the sight of Greeks dying in droves along the beach, while the greatest warrior among them sat outside his tent in a private sulk, finally broke something in him. He went to Achilles not with anger but with something closer to grief, and made a request that would change everything. Let me wear your armor. Let the Trojans see that shield, that helm, and believe Achilles has returned to the fight, even if it is only me underneath it. Achilles agreed. On one condition, drive the Trojans back from the ships and then stop. Do not press the advantage. Do not chase them all the way to the walls of Troy itself. It was sound advice, offered by a man who understood his own armor's reputation better than anyone alive. Patroclus, once he was actually inside it, once he felt the Trojan line break and run before him, would not remember the warning until it was already much too late to matter. Above the noise of the battlefield, beyond the reach of any spear or prayer, Zeus sat with a pair of golden scales balanced across his knees. On each side hung a man's fate for the days fighting to come, not a name spoken aloud, not a face he needed to look at, just wait, the plain physical fact of two lives about to end unevenly. He watched the pans settle, one dropping low toward death, the other rising light toward another day of borrowed time, and he did not reach out to correct the balance in either direction. This was not indifference exactly, though it read as indifference to anyone watching from below. It was something closer to a rule Zeus himself had agreed to keep, the oldest rule there was. Even the king of the gods does not unmake what has already been measured. He had intervened for favorites before, would intervene again, and each time the cost had come back to him doubled through some other channel, a wife's fury, a brother's grudge, a fate rebalanced elsewhere to make up the difference. So today he simply watched. No thunderbolt in his hand, no storm gathering at his command, nothing but an old god on a high seat holding two lives at arm's length and letting the scale do what scales are for. Down on the plain, men who would never know they had already been weighed kept fighting as though the outcome were still entirely their own to decide. In a sense it was. The scales only recorded what was coming. They never once claimed to cause it. That distinction, thin as it was, seemed to be the only thing keeping Zeus, this particular afternoon, from being any more of a monster than the rest of them. Before the day's fighting began, Hector went looking for his wife and found her at the wall with their infant son in her arms, already dreading what she could see coming even though no one had told her anything specific yet. He held them both, tried to reassure her the way soldiers try to reassure the people they love the night before a battle that might be their last, knowing the reassurance was mostly for himself. He reached for his son, and the boy screamed and buried his face against the nurse's shoulder, terrified of the horsehair plume nodding stiffly on top of his father's war helmet, unable to recognize the man underneath all that bronze. Hector laughed a real laugh, one of the last easy ones the story gives him, and set the helmet down on the ground beside him. Only then, bareheaded, looking like himself again instead of like the war he was about to walk back into, did his son reach for him without fear. He held the boy up toward the sky and prayed, aloud, that this small weight in his arms would one day grow up to be a better man than his father, praised louder, remembered longer. Then he handed him back, kissed his wife once, and put the helmet back on. Patroclus broke the Trojan advance exactly as promised, and then, drunk on a victory that was not entirely his own, forgot the one instruction that mattered and chased the retreating army all the way to Troy's own walls. Hector met him there. In the borrowed armor in Achilles' own bronze, Hector genuinely believed for a moment that he was finally facing the great warrior himself, and he fought accordingly, with everything he had, with a fear that gave his spear arm an extra measure of desperate strength. It was not enough. Hector's blade found the one gap the armor didn't cover, and Patroclus fell, and only as the life left him did Hector realize, with a kind of hollow dread, exactly whose armor he had just stripped from a dead man's body. Word reached Achilles' tent within the hour. He had spent days in a private sulk over a stolen woman, refusing to fight for his own pride's sake. And now the war had taken the one person whose loss made every other grievance look small and vain by comparison. He came to the trench unarmed. He had, after all, just given his armor away to a friend now lying dead in it. And he did not draw a weapon, because he did not need one. He simply stood at the edge of the fighting and screamed, a sound that came from somewhere beneath grief and beneath fury both. And the Trojan line, which had held for years against everything the Greeks could throw at it, broke and ran from a single unarmed man's voice alone. It is one of the strangest facts the whole war produces, that the most fearsome thing on that battlefield, on that particular afternoon, was not a blade or a god or an army. It was the sound of a man who had just understood, all at once, exactly what he had lost. Theseus came to Hephaestus's forge in tears, asking for one thing only: new armor for a son who had just lost everything, including the armor he used to own. Hephaestus, who owed Theseus a debt from his own fall from Olympus long before, when she had fished him broken out of the sea, did not simply grant the favor. He built through an entire night without pausing, working bronze and tin and gold and silver together at his anvil, with an artistry that went far beyond anything a battlefield actually required. At the center of it all was a shield unlike any that had ever been carried into war, engraved across its rings, in miniature and in motion, was the whole of human life laid out in bronze. A city at peace, weddings and lawsuits settled in the marketplace. A city under siege, its walls manned, its fields raided. Farmers plowing dark earth turned gold under the hammer's touch. A vineyard heavy with grapes, dancers moving in a ring at a festival, herdsmen guarding cattle from a pair of lions. Stars wheeling overhead, the whole of it circled by the great river ocean at the rim. Achilles would carry into his final, bloodiest days of fighting a shield that held every peaceful, ordinary thing his own rage was about to make impossible for someone else. Reconciled at last with Agamemnon, the theft of Briseis suddenly meaningless against the size of his new grief, Achilles put on his new armor and returned to the war with a single purpose that had nothing to do with strategy anymore. He wanted Hector, specifically, personally, and he cut through the Trojan army to get to him with a ferocity that emptied the battlefield of everything except the two of them. By the time Achilles reached the walls, the rest of the Trojan army had already fled inside, gates sealed, leaving Hector alone outside his own city for the first time in the whole war. His father Priam and his mother Hecuba called down to him from the ramparts, begging him to come inside to live, to let the war continue tomorrow instead of ending here. Hector considered it, considered running, and then did not. He stood his ground instead, told himself it was for honor, and when Achilles closed the distance between them, Hector's courage finally failed at the very last moment, and he ran 3 full circuits around the walls of his own city with Achilles in pursuit, before turning at last to face what he could no longer outrun. Achilles found the same gap in the armor that had killed Patroclus, and used it exactly the same way. Then, still not satisfied, still burning with a grief that ordinary vengeance could not touch, he pierced Hector's ankles, threaded a cord through them, tied the body to the back of his chariot, and dragged it through the dust in full view of the walls where Hector's parents and wife were watching, day after day, refusing to let even the dead have peace until his own fury finally began slowly to burn itself out. Old King Priam did something no king in his position should reasonably have done. He walked, alone and unarmed, into the tent of the man who had just killed and mutilated his son, to ask for the body back with nothing to bargain with but grief and a wagon of ransom gold. Hermes had guided him there in disguise, past sentries who somehow never turned to look, and Priam knelt before Achilles and did something even stranger than the journey itself. He kissed the hands that had killed Hector, the same hands, the same fingers, and asked Achilles to remember his own father, an old man somewhere far from this war, who would one day want his own son's body returned to him too, if it ever came to that. It should not have worked. Achilles had spent weeks in a rage too large for reason to reach, but something in Priam's specific grief, in an old man kneeling and pleading not for himself, but for a body to bury properly, reached a part of Achilles that his fury had not yet burned away. He wept for Patroclus, for his own father he would likely never see again, for Priam kneeling in front of him, for the whole senseless machinery of a war that had already cost both of them more than either could bear. He raised the old king up gently, agreed to a truce so Troy could mourn and bury Hector properly, and for one brief and strange evening, the greatest killer at Troy and the grieving father of his greatest victim sat together and shared a meal, 2 men who understood loss in exactly the same language. Getting an old, unarmed king through an entire enemy camp at night should have been impossible, and under any ordinary circumstances it would have been. Hermes made it look almost effortless. He met Priam on the road disguised as a young Greek soldier, took the reins of his wagon, and led him straight through the sleeping camp, past sentries who never turned their heads, past watchfires that somehow never caught their shadows, past soldiers who slept on undisturbed within arm's reach of the very man who had spent a decade trying to kill their king. It was not invisibility exactly. It was something quieter and stranger, the particular, absolute confidence of a god who knows precisely which details the world will simply fail to notice if he wills it so. When they reached Achilles' tent, Hermes revealed himself, told Priam plainly what he had just done and why, and slipped away again before the old king could even finish his thanks. Already needed somewhere else, as messenger gods so often are. Cassandra had been given the gift of true prophecy by Apollo himself, back when he still wanted her love and thought a god's favor might buy it. When she refused him anyway, he could not take the gift back. a god's blessing once given, cannot simply be undone, so he added a curse instead, one cruel enough to make the gift worthless. She would see everything true, and no one would ever believe a word of it. She had watched this entire war unfold exactly as she foresaw it, scene by scene, disaster by disaster, and every single warning she offered had been met with the same tired dismissal, the same rolled eyes, the same certainty that the king's strange daughter was simply unwell again. She warned about Paris before he ever sailed for Sparta. She warned about the wedding, the apple, the whole catastrophe, years before any of it happened. No one listened then, and as the war ground toward its final, most terrible turn, no one was listening now either. There is a particular kind of loneliness in knowing exactly how a story ends and watching everyone around you walk toward it anyway, certain they know better. Achilles had cut down warrior after warrior since Hector's death, unstoppable in a way that had started to feel less like courage and more like a natural law. And it was Apollo, patron god of Troy, who finally decided the war's greatest killer had taken enough Trojan lives. Apollo found Paris near the Scaean gates, the same Paris whose judgment on Mount Ida had started this entire catastrophe, now armed with nothing more heroic than a bow, a weapon most Greek warriors considered barely honorable compared to the spear. Apollo guided his hand anyway, and guided the arrow itself once it left the string, steering it past armor that had turned aside 1,000 better-aimed blows, down to the one place on Achilles' whole body that had never been dipped in the river his mother once held him over, the heel, a small, unremarkable wound on a body that had shrugged off worse 100 times, and it was enough. Achilles fell in the dust outside the same walls he had dragged Hector's body around, the greatest warrior of the entire war, undone not by strength, but by the single inch his mother's grip had left exposed. The fighting around him stopped for a long moment, both armies briefly united in simple disbelief that Achilles, of all men, could actually die. Word reached his mother in the sea before the sun had fully set, and Thetis rose from the water one final time to grieve over a son she had tried, imperfectly but completely, to make safe from exactly this. The Greeks built him a pyre worthy of everything he had been: gold, oil, the finest robes in the camp, and the flames climbed as high as any funeral fire the war had yet produced. He had chosen this once, standing at a fork in his own fate with his eyes open. Even knowing that, even having chosen it himself, it did not make the loss any smaller for the men who had to keep fighting a war without him. With Achilles dead and his shield and armor lying unclaimed on the battlefield, Hephaestus's masterwork, the greatest set of war gear any mortal had ever worn, 2 Greek heroes stepped forward to claim it, and the whole camp understood immediately that this decision would matter as much as any battle. Ajax, the largest and physically strongest man in the entire Greek army, second only to Achilles himself in raw combat, believed the armor belonged to him by simple right of size and courage. He had, after all, carried Achilles' body off the battlefield himself under heavy fire. Odysseus argued a different case, one built on cunning rather than muscle. The war, he pointed out, had been won as much by strategy as by strength, and the assembly, weighing the 2 arguments, agreed with him and awarded the armor to Odysseus instead. For Ajax, a warrior whose entire identity was built on being the strongest man other than Achilles at Troy, the loss was not survivable in the way a battlefield wound would have been. It struck at something no shield could protect. He withdrew to his tent that night in a fury and a shame too large to carry, And by morning the Greek camp understood that the war had claimed one more of its greatest fighters, though this time without a single Trojan spear involved. 10 years of siege had taught Odysseus that Troy's wall would never fall to force. The gods who built it had made certain of that. If the city could not be broken open, it would have to be tricked open instead, and Odysseus devised a plan so strange it very nearly failed on the strength of how unbelievable it was. The Greeks, under his direction, built a colossal wooden horse, hollow through its belly, large enough to hide a company of their best-armed soldiers inside its ribs, Odysseus himself among them, unwilling to trust so much to a plan he had not personally seen through. Around the horse's construction, they built a story. This was an offering to Athena, built to atone for years of war and to ensure the Greeks a safe voyage home, deliberately made too large to fit through Troy's gate, so it could never be taken inside the walls and turned into a Trojan blessing instead of a Greek one. Then, in full view of the watching city, the Greek fleet struck its camp, burned what it did not need, and sailed out of sight around the nearest headland, not home, only far enough to look like retreat. Behind on the beach, alone, one man remained. Sinon, left deliberately, briefed carefully, prepared to tell the Trojans exactly the story they most wanted to hear. Odysseus had planned every visible piece of it. He simply had not yet learned, crouched in the dark belly of his own invention, whether Troy would actually be foolish enough to believe it. Sinon played his part exactly as rehearsed. Captured, weeping, apparently abandoned by his own side, he told the Trojans the horse was a peace offering to Athena, deliberately built too large for their gate so the Greeks could never be blamed for smuggling a blessing meant for Troy. Most of the city wanted to believe him. After 10 years of siege, the temptation to believe the war was finally, actually over proved stronger than caution. Laocoon, a priest of Apollo, did not believe him. He warned the assembled crowd that he feared Greeks bearing gifts of any kind, and drove his spear into the horse's flank to prove his suspicion, the wood ringing hollow under the blow in a way that should have ended the argument on the spot. It did not. Before the crowd could fully weigh what the hollow sound meant, 2 enormous serpents rose from the sea and crossed the shore, coiling around Laocoon and both his sons and crushing the life out of all 3 in front of the entire city. A horror the Trojans read not as a warning, but as a punishment, proof, they decided, that the gods themselves wanted the horse brought inside. Cassandra screamed the truth into the same crowd one more time and was ignored one more time as always. The Trojans tore down a section of their own unbreachable wall, wide enough to admit what their own hands had refused to let through the gate, and dragged the horse into the city themselves, then spent the night celebrating a war they believed. At last, they had actually won. Well past midnight, with the city finally quiet after a night of drinking and relief the Trojans believed they had earned, the soldiers hidden inside the horse's hollow belly climbed down one by one, silent, weapons already in hand. Sinon slipped away from the celebration and lit a signal fire visible from the sea, and the Greek fleet, which had never actually sailed home, turned back toward the shore they had only pretended to leave. The hidden soldiers moved through Troy's streets and threw open the very gates the city had spent 10 years defending. And by the time most of Troy understood what was happening, the entire Greek army was already inside the walls that had never once been breached by force. Because in the end, they never needed to be. Fire took the city block by block, temple by temple, palace by palace, spreading faster than any single household could fight it, faster than the confused, half-drunk defenders could organize any real resistance. A city that had outlasted a full decade of open siege, fell in a single night to a plan built entirely on a lie small enough to fit inside a wooden horse. By dawn, everything the wall had protected for generations, the halls, the shrines, the palace of a king who had once refused to pay for the very stones that failed to save him, stood in ash and open sky, and the age the whole war had been fought to defend went with it, burning down to embers before the sun had even fully risen. Odysseus and a dozen of his men, scouting for supplies on their long way home from Troy, made the mistake of exploring a cave that turned out to belong to Polyphemus, a cyclops, a one-eyed giant, son of the sea god Poseidon, who returned from tending his flocks to find uninvited guests inside his home, and responded by sealing the entrance with a boulder. No 10 ordinary men could have moved, then eating 2 of Odysseus's crew for his evening meal, without the slightest hesitation. Trapped, Odysseus did not panic into a fight he could not win against a creature roughly the size of a small hill. He offered the giant strong wine instead, more than Polyphemus had ever tasted, and when the Cyclops, drunk and pleased, asked his guest's name, Odysseus answered with a lie clever enough to become famous on its own. Nobody. Once Polyphemus finally collapsed into a wine-heavy sleep, Odysseus and his surviving men sharpened a great wooden stake, heated its point in the fire, and drove it into the giant's single eye together, all their weight behind it. Polyphemus's scream brought the other Cyclopes running to his cave entrance, calling out to ask what was wrong. "Nobody is attacking me," he howled back, and his neighbors, hearing that, assumed nothing serious was happening at all and went back to their own homes. In the morning, blind and desperate, Polyphemus felt along the backs of his own sheep as he let them out to graze, checking for escaping men on top of them, never thinking to check underneath, where Odysseus and his crew clung to the sheep's bellies and slipped past him into freedom, and into the much longer trouble his name trick was about to cause them. Blind, humiliated, and furious in a way that went beyond ordinary anger, Polyphemus did the one thing left available to him. He prayed. Not to just any god, but to his own father, Poseidon, lord of the sea that Odysseus and his men still had to cross to get home. He asked for something specific and vindictive. Not a quick death for the man who had blinded him, which would have been mercy, but a voyage home so long and so brutal that Odysseus would arrive an old man, alone, having lost every companion along the way, only to find his own household in ruins waiting for him. Poseidon, already inclined to favor his own son's grievances over a mortal's cleverness, heard the prayer and took it seriously. He could not kill Odysseus outright. Other gods, Athena chief among them, had their own claims on the man's survival, but he could make the geography of the sea itself into an enemy. Storm after storm, island after island, delay after delay, and he set about doing exactly that with the patient, thorough cruelty only a god insulted through his own child can really summon. Circe, the sorceress who had already delayed Odysseus a full year on her island, warned him before he sailed on about a stretch of coast no sailor had ever passed and lived to describe firsthand. The sirens, creatures with the faces and voices of beautiful women fused to the bodies of great taloned birds, perched on a shore littered with the bones of every man who had ever sailed close enough to hear them sing. Their song promised each listener exactly what he most wanted to hear: knowledge, glory, whatever private hunger drove him, and no man had ever heard it and kept enough of his own will to sail past. Odysseus, curious to the point of recklessness, wanted to hear the song anyway and survive it, so he had his crew plug their own ears with soft wax, deaf to everything, while he alone stood exposed to the sound, lashed tightly to the mast with orders that no matter how he begged, no matter how he threatened, they were not to untie him until the island was well behind them. The sirens sang, and Odysseus strained against the ropes with everything in him, shouting to be freed, promising anything, meaning every word of it in the moment. And his deaf crew rowed on exactly as instructed, unmoved by a captain's frantic pleading they could not hear at all, until the island's cliffs finally sank back below the horizon, and the song faded into ordinary wind and water. Circe had warned Odysseus about this stretch of water too, a narrow strait with two horrors facing each other across it, close enough that avoiding one meant sailing directly within reach of the other. On one side, high in a sea cliff cave, lived Scylla, once a woman, transformed by a jealous rival into something with 6 long serpentine necks, each ending in a head lined with 3 rows of teeth, permanently hungry, permanently reaching down toward any ship that passed close enough beneath her. On the other side churned Charybdis, a whirlpool violent enough to swallow the sea itself whole 3 times a day and spit it back out again, capable of pulling an entire ship down into her throat if a captain misjudged the distance by even a few oar lengths. Circe's advice was blunt and difficult to hear. Hug Scylla's side of the strait, accept the loss she would take, because losing 6 men to her reaching heads was a certainty Odysseus could survive, while sailing too close to Charybdis risked losing the ship and every man aboard it at once. Odysseus, unable to warn his rowers without freezing them in terror at their oars, kept the choice to himself and steered as close to Scylla's cliff as he dared. 6 of his best men vanished screaming into her jaws before the rest of the crew even understood what was happening, and Odysseus watched it happen, unable to stop it, because the alternative had genuinely been worse. On the voyage home, after Odysseus's men made the fatal mistake of slaughtering cattle sacred to the sun god Helios despite every warning, Zeus answered the sacrilege with a storm that tore Odysseus's last remaining ship apart at sea, and drowned every man aboard it except Odysseus himself, who clung to the broken mast and keel lashed together as makeshift wreckage, while the current, with a kind of grim inevitability, carried him directly back toward the same strait he had barely survived once already. This time there was no crew left to warn, no choice to make between 2 evils, only Charybdis, directly ahead, and no ship left worth steering. The whirlpool swallowed his wreckage whole, mast and all, and Odysseus, with nothing left to hold onto, reached up instead and caught hold of a fig tree growing out from the cliff above the churning water, and simply hung there, suspended between the sea trying to devour him and the rock offering no other foothold, waiting with a patience that had nothing left to lose. When Charybdis finally, hours later, spat his mast and keel back up to the surface the way she always eventually did, Odysseus let go of the tree, dropped back into the sea, and swam to his makeshift raft, alone now in every sense the word allows, the last man of an entire crew that had sailed with him out of Troy. What should have been a voyage of a few weeks stretched, through storm and detour and one god's patient grudge, into 10 full years, as long as the war itself had lasted, doubling the total time Odysseus spent away from a home he was beginning to fear he might never actually reach. He was blown to the land of the lotus eaters, where the fruit made his men forget they had ever wanted to go home at all, and had to drag them back to the ships by force. He spent a year on Circe's island, willingly at first, then reluctantly, then finally departing only because his own men reminded him a wife and son were still waiting somewhere behind them. He was held for 7 long years by the nymph Calypso, who wanted him for a husband and offered him immortality itself if he would simply stay, an offer he refused, choosing instead to keep aging toward a home that might not even remember him by the time he reached it. Through all of it, on a rocky island called Ithaca, his wife Penelope kept a house full of unwanted suitors at bay through nothing but her own patient cunning, weaving a burial shroud by day and secretly unweaving it by night to delay a decision she had no intention of ever actually making. Certain in a way she could not fully explain that her husband was still out there somewhere, still trying to get back to her, one storm-tossed island at a time. Both of them, across 10 years and half a world of water, were doing the exact same thing, refusing to stop waiting. Odysseus finally reached the shore of Ithaca after 20 years away, 10 fighting at Troy, 10 more fighting his way home from it, and did not even recognize the place at first, because Athena had wrapped the whole coastline in a concealing mist to keep him hidden from Poseidon's lingering anger and from the suitors currently occupying his own hall. He woke on the sand disoriented, uncertain whether the Phaeacian sailors who had finally carried him home had simply abandoned him on some unfamiliar shore. And it was Athena, appearing to him in disguise as she so often did, who finally lifted the fog with her own hand and let him see his own homeland clearly for the first time in 2 decades. She did not let him rush in unprepared. She warned him plainly about the suitors filling his hall, about the danger of announcing himself before he understood exactly what he was walking back into, and she disguised him as an old beggar, weathered and unrecognizable, so he could move through his own kingdom unseen and learn the truth of it before revealing himself to anyone. Odysseus, who had spent 10 years surviving by exactly this kind of patience, accepted the disguise without complaint and set off toward his own home looking like a stranger to everyone in it, sheltering for a time among his own shepherds and swineherds, listening far more than he spoke, gathering everything he would need to know before the one moment that would actually matter. It was, in its way, the last and quietest test of the entire voyage, to stand this close to home and wait a little longer anyway. For years, more than 100 suitors had occupied Odysseus's hall, eating his stores, courting his wife, and treating his household as though its absent master were unquestionably dead, and his throne simply waiting to be claimed by whichever of them proved most persistent. Penelope had held them off through patience, through delay, through a shroud she wove by day and quietly undid by night. But the suitors had finally grown too impatient and too numerous to stall any longer with excuses alone. So she set them a contest instead, one that looked, on its surface, like a fair and reasonable test. String her husband's old hunting bow, the great curved weapon he had left behind 20 years earlier, and shoot a single arrow clean through the aligned sockets of 12 axe heads set in a row, the way Odysseus himself had once done for sport. Whichever suitor could manage it would win her hand and the kingdom along with it. She believed correctly that not one of them actually could. The suitors tried the bow one after another, straining against a weapon that had grown, over 20 years of disuse, into something closer to legend than to an ordinary tool, and one after another they failed, some barely able to bend it at all, their confidence curdling into embarrassment in front of the entire hall. Off to one side, dressed in a beggar's rags no one had thought worth a second look, an old man watched every failed attempt with an attention none of the suitors noticed. When every suitor had failed, and the contest seemed ready to be abandoned as unwinnable, the old beggar who had been watching quietly from the edges of the hall asked, politely, if he might be allowed to try. The suitors laughed at him, openly, cruelly, certain that a ragged old wanderer succeeding where 100 younger, stronger men had just failed was somewhere between impossible and insulting to even suggest. Penelope, who did not yet know who stood beneath the rags, insisted he be given the same chance as everyone else, if only out of the fairness she had built the entire contest around. The beggar took the bow into his hands the way an old friend takes hold of something he has missed for a very long time, and in a single smooth, practiced motion, without visible strain, without the desperate wrestling every suitor before him had needed, he strung it. The laughter in the hall died instantly. He knocked an arrow, drew, and loosed it clean through all 12 aligned axe heads in one shot, exactly as Odysseus himself was famous for having once done, and the silence that followed was the sound of 100 men beginning, all at once, to understand precisely what they were looking at. He set the bow down, straightened, and for the first time in 20 years let the disguise fall away from his own face in front of the men who had spent years eating his food and courting his wife. He did not need to announce his name. Every suitor in that hall already knew it, and every suitor in that hall understood, in the same instant, exactly how much trouble they were now standing in. Trapped inside a locked hall with an armed man who had just spent an entire war, proving what he was capable of doing to people who underestimated him. With the doors barred and every exit sealed by his own son Telemachus beforehand, Odysseus turned the bow that had just humiliated 100 suitors into the first weapon of a reckoning 20 years in the making. He shot the loudest and cruelest of them first, a man who had spent years treating Odysseus's household as his personal property, and only once that first body hit the floor did the rest of the hall finally understand this was not a trick or a demonstration. It was an execution, and every man in that room who had spent years courting another man's wife and eating another man's stores while he fought his way home was about to answer for it in the same afternoon. Some of the suitors tried to fight back with whatever weapons they could reach. Most simply ran for exits that were no longer there, discovering too late that the same patience Odysseus had shown for 20 years of wandering applied equally well to planning an ambush inside his own house. Telemachus stood beside his father through all of it, a boy who had been an infant when Odysseus sailed for Troy, and was now a young man fighting shoulder to shoulder with a father he had spent his entire childhood only imagining. By the time the hall fell silent again, every suitor who had occupied Odysseus's house lay dead across a floor that had, 20 years earlier, hosted an entirely different kind of gathering. It was not a gentle homecoming, and the poets who told this story never pretended it was one. It was the ugly, necessary, exhausting last labor of a man who had survived a war, a decade of monsters, and a god's personal grudge, only to find that even his own front door required one final battle before he could finally, actually, be allowed to rest. Somewhere upstairs, a woman who had waited 20 years for this exact morning was only now beginning to let herself believe it might really be him. Odysseus proved himself to Penelope not with a name or a scar, but with a secret only the two of them had ever shared. Their marriage bed had been built around a living olive tree, rooted still in the ground beneath the floor, immovable because he alone had carved it that way 20 years before. When he described it to her unprompted, she finally let herself believe the stranger in her hall really was her husband, and they wept together the way people weep when a wait finally, actually ends. The next morning he found his own father Laertes alone in a neglected orchard, and proved himself again the same patient way, naming, one by one, every tree the old man had given him as a boy memory standing in for magic. Word of the slaughtered suitors reached their families fast, and for one dangerous evening, It looked as though Ithaca might tear itself apart in a blood feud on top of everything the war had already cost it. Athena stepped between the two sides herself and imposed a peace, plain and absolute. The last direct intervention this entire long story has to offer, and it is worth noticing what kind it is. Not a thunderbolt, not a monster slain, a goddess simply insisting that two grieving households put down their weapons and go home. After an age of gods walking openly among mortals, swallowed as infants and disgorged again, warring with titans for the sky itself, shaping the first men from river clay, cursing weavers and hunters and queens who boasted too loudly, sending heroes against lions and hydras and one-eyed giants, weighing the fates of men on golden scales without ever once stepping down to change them. This is where the visible age quietly closes, not with a final battle, with a goddess telling two families to go home. The stories did not end there. Men and women kept telling them at their own hearths for generation after generation, kept naming their children after Achilles and Helen and clever, patient Odysseus, kept arguing over how much of it had ever really happened and how much had simply grown in the retelling, the way all the best stories do. But the gods themselves receded, the way a tide recedes, no single vanishing, just less and less presence in the ordinary business of living, until a whole civilization looked back at the thunderbolt and the spear and the grudging sea, and found itself genuinely unsure whether any of it had been real at all. That uncertainty may be the last gift the old gods left behind, a world finally handed over to the people who had always done the actual living and dying in it, free at last to decide for themselves what the story meant, and free, if they chose, to keep telling it anyway.